It was not a single victory. It was endurance weaponized. In June 1941, Germany hurled over 3 million soldiers across a frontier stretching nearly 2,000 miles. Army Group North drove toward Leningrad. Army Group Center targeted Moscow. Army Group South lunged for Ukraine's grain fields and industrial zones. They carried with them more than 3,000 tanks, artillery pieces firing shells weighing over 20 pounds, and logistical columns hauling hundreds of tons of fuel and ammunition each day. Early encirclements trapped Soviet formations in numbers exceeding 300,000 prisoners at Minsk and Smolensk alone. On paper, the Red Army fractured, but paper does not measure depth. The Soviet Union possessed geography that extended beyond the horizon of German planning. Rail lines ran east toward the Ural Mountains. Factories weighing thousands of tons in machinery were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and relocated beyond immediate German reach. Entire industrial complexes moved east in weeks. By 1943, Soviet industry produced tens of thousands of tanks annually, including T-34 models, with sloped armor several inches thick, and guns firing shells weighing roughly 15 pounds. Quantity did not replace skill, but it compensated for loss. In the summer of 1942, German forces pushed toward the Volga River and the oil fields of the Caucasus. At Stalingrad, an entire German field army, numbering over 200,000 men, became encircled. Soviet artillery fired thousands of shells daily into compressed German positions. Supply flights attempted to deliver hundreds of tons of food and ammunition by air, but Luftwaffe transport capacity fell short of required tonnage. German units inside the pocket consumed supplies faster than aircraft could land. Frostbite and starvation eroded combat effectiveness before final surrender. Inside a Soviet factory east of the Urals, workers labored beside half-assembled tank hulls as temperatures dropped below freezing. Sparks flew from welding torches. Production quotas were measured in dozens of vehicles per week per line. Steel plates were riveted and welded into shape under pressure that did not pause for air raids, because the factories were now beyond German bombers' easy reach. Those tanks would travel thousands of miles west by rail before entering combat. The Eastern Front consumed men at rates measured in the millions. Soviet casualties by war's end exceeded 10 million military dead. Entire divisions were reduced to fractions of authorized strength within weeks. Casualty rates in certain defensive battles exceeded 60%. Yet mobilization systems continued feeding replacements into frontline units. Training was often abbreviated. Equipment distribution was uneven, but the flow did not stop. When I once examined monthly Soviet production statistics alongside German tank loss reports from 1943, the disparity sharpened into focus. German factories, under Allied bombing and constrained by raw material shortages, struggled to replace losses at Kursk and beyond. Soviet factories, though strained, produced enough T-34s to offset destruction, and then some. The contest hardened into who could absorb greater bleed without systemic collapse. Kursk in July 1943 marked another inflection. Germany assembled nearly 3,000 tanks and assault guns for Operation Citadel. Soviet defenses layered minefields containing hundreds of thousands of anti-tank mines, anti-tank guns dug into prepared positions, and artillery arrays calibrated in depth measured in miles. When German panzers advanced, they collided with defensive belts designed to stall and fracture armored thrusts. Losses mounted, offensive power eroded. After Kursk, German forces increasingly fought defensively in the east. Inside a T-34, advancing during a counteroffensive, the crew felt the diesel engine vibrate beneath them as tracks clattered over churned earth. The 85mm gun in later models fired shells with lethal velocity. The interior was cramped, the air thick with fumes, but fuel stocks were available in greater quantities than German formations could reliably access by 1944. Movement, once monopolized by the Wehrmacht, shifted east to west. Soviet operational art recalibrated over time. Early war rigidity gave way to coordinated offensives that integrated infantry, armor, artillery, and air support. In Operation Bagration in 1944, Soviet forces annihilated German Army Group Center. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Entire divisions ceased to exist. Rail lines and supply depots fell. The front collapsed backward, hundreds of miles. The Soviet Union also benefited from Allied material support through Lend-Lease. Hundreds of thousands of trucks delivered mobility to Red Army logistics. Rail cars, locomotives, canned food measured in millions of rations, and aviation fuel supplemented domestic production. The Soviet system did not rely solely on its own output. It integrated external supply where possible. Yet victory did not arrive cleanly. Cities such as Leningrad endured sieges lasting nearly 900 days. Civilians starved. Industrial workers operated under bombardment. Frontline soldiers fought in temperatures dropping below -20 degrees Celsius. Rifles froze. Engines required external heating to start. Endurance became institutional. The German army bled continuously on the Eastern Front. By 1945, German military casualties in the East numbered in the millions. Fuel shortages immobilized armored units. Replacement drafts arrived younger and less trained. Air superiority tilted toward the Soviets as German aviation fuel supplies dwindled under bombing. Every retreat shortened the distance to Berlin. If you lean into this with me for a moment, imagine the scale. A front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, thousands of miles long. Then narrow it down to one infantryman in a trench near the Dnieper River, gripping a rifle as artillery shakes the ground. Snow falls. Orders arrive to advance again at dawn. Above him, entire army groups maneuver. Beneath him, frozen soil holds fragments of shell. The Soviet Union won the Eastern Front by absorbing initial shock without systemic collapse, relocating industry beyond enemy reach, producing weapons in quantities that outpaced German replacement, integrating operational lessons learned in blood, and maintaining mobilization despite catastrophic casualties. It fractured German offensive capacity at Stalingrad, stalled it at Kursk, and then outpaced it westward through relentless offensives. When I look at divisional strength returns from 1941 compared to 1944, the pattern is unmistakable. The Wehrmacht's experienced corps thinned beyond recovery. The Red Army, battered early, recalibrated into a force capable of sustained combined operations. Attrition became asymmetric. If you are listening now, perhaps letting the quiet settle around you, imagine the vast eastern plain under a winter sky. Tanks moving slowly westward, artillery rumbling in the distance, factories far beyond the Urals still welding steel late into the night. The scale is immense, yet the sound is steady. Not dramatic, steady. Pressure applied over years. In the chapters ahead, we will move from Barbarossa through Moscow, Stalingrad, Kursk, Operation Bagration, and the final assault on Berlin. This is the entire history of how the Soviet Union won the Eastern Front in the Second World War. Chapter 1. The Arsonist's Map. The 14th of June, 1941. Moscow. A government press office, somewhere in the upper floors of a building near the Kremlin, humming with the low bureaucratic energy of a Tuesday afternoon. A typewriter strikes. A carbon copy is made. 7 copies, to be precise. That particular detail comes from the Soviet State Archive, where copy number 3 survives, its edges slightly browned, the typing slightly off-center in the way of hurried work. The document is a communiqué from the TASS news agency, and it announces formally and publicly that rumors of German military aggression toward the Soviet Union are without foundation. The word used in the original Russian is bezosnovatelny, baseless. Someone, at some point after the document was filed, added a handwritten annotation in blue pencil in the margin. Распространять немедленно, distribute immediately. 8 days later, 3 million soldiers crossed the Soviet border simultaneously, along a front stretching nearly 2,000 kilometers. The communiqué remained in the archive. The border did not. What I find extraordinary, genuinely, not rhetorically, is that the June 14th communiqué was not a document of ignorance. When I was cross-referencing Soviet intelligence summaries with the TASS archive records, it became clear that between January and June of 1941, Soviet military intelligence had forwarded at least 84 separate reports to Stalin, warning of an imminent German attack. 84. Not rumors passed between nervous officers in corridors, but formal intelligence assessments, some from sources embedded within German military planning circles. Stalin, according to post-Soviet archival research by historians including Oleg Klevniuk, reportedly wrote the word provokatsiya, provocation, across more than a dozen of them personally. The margin notes survive. The red crayon handwriting survives. The choice to dismiss all of it survives in the archive, quietly and permanently, alongside the decision's consequences. The communiqué wasn't a mistake in the ordinary sense. It was an institution performing the denial that its leader had mandated. The official record of what happened in the hours immediately before the invasion is, to use the most honest possible word, contested. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, in his 1969 memoirs, Reminiscences and Reflections, states that he telephoned Stalin in the early hours of the 22nd of June and personally pleaded for authorization to issue a defensive alert to Soviet border forces. He describes Stalin's response as several minutes of silence on the line. It's a powerful image, the general, the silence, the weight of what was coming. But when post-Soviet historians examined Stalin's Kremlin visitor logs, documents released in the 1990s, they showed that at the precise time Zhukov describes this telephone call, Stalin was meeting with Beria, the head of the NKVD, in person. One of those accounts cannot be entirely accurate. I'm not suggesting Zhukov fabricated the exchange, but the discrepancy matters enormously because the assignment of responsibility for what followed rests partly on reconstructing that night, and the archive gives us two versions that don't quite fit together. On the German side of the border, at 03:15 hours on the 22nd of June, 1941, the artillery opened. The target was the Brest-Litovsk fortress, a massive 19th century fortification sitting directly on the Soviet-German demarcation line, garrisoned by tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers who were, in the main, asleep. The after-action reports filed by surviving Fourth Army officers, held at the Russian State Military Archive, Fond 500, describe a fortress garrison that responded with genuine ferocity, despite being caught completely unprepared. What those reports also reveal, and what official Soviet histories consistently underemphasized, is that the fortress's communications with higher command were severed within the first few minutes of the barrage. The soldiers inside couldn't receive orders, even if orders had existed to send them. They fought because there was nothing else available to do. The fortress held out, in pockets, for weeks. The evening before the invasion, the 21st of June, a German army corporal named Alfred Liskow crossed the Soviet border near the city of Sokol in Ukraine and surrendered to Soviet border guards. He told them the German attack was scheduled for the following morning. His warning was forwarded up the chain of command with appropriate urgency. The response that came back down, reportedly originating from Moscow, was an instruction to treat Liskow as a likely German agent sent to provoke the Soviet Union into a preemptive military action that Germany could then characterize as aggression. Liskow was not the first and not the last. The Soviet border guards on the night of the 21st of June 1941 were, in a sense, perfect mirrors of the institutional logic that had produced the task communiqué. They were operating a system that had trained itself, at enormous cost and over many years, to disbelieve the most obvious incoming information. The system worked exactly as designed. By noon on the 22nd of June, it was Vyacheslav Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, who addressed the Soviet people by radio, not Stalin. The speech is short. It ends with the phrase, "Naše delo pravoje, pobjeda будет za nami." Our cause is just, victory will be ours. The phrase became a rallying slogan. Stalin himself said nothing publicly for 11 days. The records of those 11 days, what Stalin was doing, who he was meeting, what his psychological state was, have been pieced together by historians from fragmentary Kremlin visitor logs and second-hand accounts, and they remain one of the genuine mysteries of the war's opening. Dmitry Volkogonov's biography of Stalin, drawing on documents released in the post-Soviet period, describes those 11 days as a period of something close to paralysis. Whether that represents grief, calculation, or collapse is a question the archive has not fully resolved. To me, the most telling detail in the entire opening of this war isn't the artillery barrage, or the encirclements, or even the staggering aircraft losses, and we'll come to those numbers because they're genuinely difficult to absorb. The most telling detail is that on the morning of the 22nd of June, the Red Army's western military districts had standing orders that explicitly prohibited provocative actions against German forces without direct authorization from Moscow. Those orders were still technically in effect when the German tanks crossed the border. Some Soviet commanders, receiving the news of the German advance, initially reported it to higher headquarters as a provocation rather than an invasion, because that was the only category their institutional framework provided. They were operating the vocabulary they'd been given, even as the world it described was ceasing to exist. In the first 72 hours of Operation Barbarossa, German Army Group Center, whose war diary is held at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg, enclosed approximately 325,000 Soviet troops in the Bialystok-Minsk pocket. The diary's entries during those days are written in the clipped, professional language of a staff that was recording events it found astonishing in their ease. One entry notes, almost as an administrative observation, that enemy resistance is disorganized, with little evidence of coordinated command. This was true. It was true because the command structure had been built, through the Purges, through centralization, through the deliberate punishment of individual initiative, to be incapable of functioning without authorization from above. When the communications lines were cut in the first minutes of the barrage, the system simply had no secondary mode to fall into. Individual units fought with extraordinary courage. The institution above them had ceased to function before the war was an hour old. When I read through the German Fremde Heer Ost, the Wehrmacht's Eastern intelligence summaries, for the weeks immediately following Barbarossa, I found something that has stayed with me. German intelligence officers were noting, with evident puzzlement, that Soviet units were continuing to fight after encirclement. The predicted collapse, which OKH planning documents had scheduled at 8 to 10 weeks, wasn't happening cleanly. Individual formations, cut off from supply and command, were conducting local counterattacks with no hope of strategic effect. A German divisional war diary entry from early July 1941 describes a pocket of Soviet soldiers, entirely surrounded, attacking outward rather than attempting to surrender. The German officer filing the report apparently didn't have a clean tactical category for it. He called it fanatisch, but I don't think that's what it was. I think it was something simpler and harder to categorize. Men in a terrible situation, doing the only physical thing they could think to do. By the end of June 1941, the Red Army had lost an estimated 4,381 aircraft, the overwhelming majority destroyed on the ground, lined up on their airfields in precise rows, exactly where they'd been parked when the order not to provoke Germany was still in force. The Royal Air Force's Fighter Command, at the height of the Battle of Britain a year earlier, had fielded roughly 650 serviceable aircraft. The Soviet Air Forces lost 6 times that number in 3 weeks. The task communique, with its blue pencil margin note, was still in its archive folder. The carbon copies, all 7 of them, were presumably filed. The typewriter that produced it was still on its desk somewhere in that government building near the Kremlin. And the war, which was going to last nearly 4 more years, and cost a number of lives that I still find impossible to fully hold in my mind, had barely begun. Chapter 2. The Burning Archive. What Stalin Destroyed Before the War. Sometime in the autumn of 1937, a copy of a Soviet military field manual was removed from circulation. The manual was titled Polovoye Upravlenie Voiskami, Field Management of Troops, and it had been issued to Red Army officers as the doctrinal foundation for a specific theory of warfare. The idea that a modern army could defeat its enemy not by pushing through the front line, but by striking the enemy's entire operational depth simultaneously, collapsing logistics, command, and reserves at the same moment the forward line was engaged. The manual's primary intellectual architect was Marshal Mikhail Nikolaevich Tukhachevsky. By the time the manual was withdrawn, Tukhachevsky had been dead for 4 months. He was executed on the 12th of June, 1937, following a tribunal that lasted approximately 1 hour and 50 minutes. The rubber stamp that marked his field manual, withdrawn from circulation, is, to me, one of the most consequential bureaucratic actions of the entire 20th century. The personnel file for Tukhachevsky at the Russian State Military Archive, catalogued under Fond 37,837, is a document that rewards careful examination. It contains the standard service record, the promotions, the commendations. It also contains, toward the back, an NKVD interrogation transcript dated the 10th of June, 1937, in which Tukhachevsky confesses to being a German intelligence agent. The confession is typed in a controlled, clerical hand. Forensic archivists who examined the document in 1992 identified a brownish, circular stain in the lower right corner of one page, approximately 2 centimeters in diameter, as consistent with blood. Whether it was Tukhachevsky's or someone else's, the archive doesn't say, but the document exists. The stain exists. And the confession it contains is the foundation on which the Soviet Union's most important military thinker was killed, and with him, for a time, the doctrine that would eventually win the war. Tukhachevsky's concept, which Soviet military theory refers to as глубокое оперативное искусство, or deep operational art, was not a sudden inspiration. It developed over the course of the 1920s and 1930s in a series of lectures, articles, and field exercises, and it was codified most completely in the 1936 Field Regulations, known as PU-36. The doctrine had three essential technical requirements. First, frontline commanders had to be empowered to make independent decisions without waiting for authorization from above, because simultaneous multi-axis operations moved too fast for centralized approval. Second, tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, and aircraft had to operate as integrated combined arms units, not as separate branches coordinated from distant headquarters. Third, a sophisticated radio communications network had to connect these formations in real time across hundreds of kilometers. All three requirements were systematically dismantled between 1937 and 1941, not through bureaucratic drift, but through specific, directed policy decisions. Independent command thinking was labeled Bonapartism. Combined arms formations were dissolved back into separate branch commands after the 1939 Finnish War, and radio operators were distrusted as potential foreign spies. The doctrine was orphaned, then buried. Between 1937 and 1938, the Red Army lost, through execution, imprisonment, or forced retirement, approximately 35,000 officers out of a total commissioned officer corps of roughly 144,000. The mathematics of that are worth sitting with. In 24 months, the Soviet state removed 24% of its own officer corps. 3 of its 5 marshals were shot. 13 of its 16 army commanders were shot or imprisoned. 50 of its 67 corps commanders were removed. 154 of its 199 divisional commanders were shot or discharged. The historian Roger Rees, in his work on the Red Army's institutional structure, has argued that the Purges' damage is sometimes overstated because the Army was expanding so rapidly that a genuinely competent senior officer corps was largely a fiction even before 1937. That's a fair point and worth considering. But John Erickson, whose access to Soviet archival materials was broader, makes the counter-argument that cuts more deeply. The Purge was catastrophic specifically because it killed the theorists, the men who understood why the doctrine worked, not just how to follow it. You can train a replacement officer in a year. You can't train a replacement institutional memory. In November of 1940, the Red Army conducted a large strategic war game at its General Staff headquarters in Moscow. The exercise was designed to test Soviet operational planning against a simulated German-style offensive. The German forces were commanded by General Dmitry Pavlov. The Soviet forces were commanded by General Georgy Zhukov. Pavlov, using the kind of fast-moving combined arms assault that Tukhachevsky had theorized and the Germans had adopted, defeated Zhukov's forces comprehensively in every scenario. The war game results were compiled into a detailed report and presented to Stalin. According to David Glantz's analysis in Stumbling Colossus, Stalin was displeased with the results. The report was reclassified. Pavlov was later appointed to command the Western Special Military District, the formation that would be most catastrophically destroyed in the first days of Barbarossa. He was shot in July 1941. Officially, for cowardice and dereliction of duty. He hadn't been cowardly. He'd been given an institution that couldn't fight the way the war game had shown it needed to. When I was working through the materials on the Frunze Military Academy during this period, I came across a detail that I find genuinely remarkable, though I want to be careful about the word remarkable, because it gets overused. At the Frunze Academy, a small number of junior officers in the late 1930s maintained unofficial copies of Tukhachevsky's theoretical writing in the form of classified study materials that had never been formally recalled. These weren't dissident documents. They weren't hidden out of ideological conviction. They were simply files that had been missed by the withdrawal process, filed in cabinet drawers that nobody looked at during the sweep. When Soviet commanders began reconstructing combined arms doctrine in 1942 and 1943, they were drawing partly on a theoretical framework that had been preserved in a Frunze filing cabinet, not through heroism, but through administrative oversight. The archive that nearly wasn't. It fascinates me how often Tukhachevsky appears in the official Soviet histories of the war as a kind of absent presence, the thing that's not quite named. The doctrine that won the war at Kursk and Bagration is demonstrably descended from his theoretical work, but Soviet-era historiography couldn't acknowledge that directly because it would have meant acknowledging that the man Stalin killed in 1937 was right, and that killing him had cost the country something real. Post-Soviet Russian historians have been more candid. The rehabilitation of Tukhachevsky's theoretical legacy, as distinct from his political rehabilitation, which happened under Khrushchev, is still in some ways an ongoing project. The doctrine has a name now. The man who built it still has a blood-stained confession in his archive file. The operational consequences of dismantling Pu-36's 3 technical requirements manifested almost immediately in the Soviet-Finnish War of 1939 to 1940. The Red Army attacked Finland with significant numerical superiority and nearly suffered a strategic defeat. Soviet units lost coordination within hours of advancing. Combined arms formations failed to function because the different branches, tanks, infantry, artillery, were commanded through separate chains that converged only at very high levels, meaning that a tank commander and an infantry commander advancing in the same sector couldn't coordinate directly without routing communication through a headquarters dozens of kilometers in the rear. The winter temperatures during that campaign reached -40°C in some sectors. Soviet tank crews were found frozen in their vehicles. The after-action analysis compiled by the People's Commissariat of Defense in early 1940 identified the command structure as a primary failure. The lesson was partially absorbed, and then, before the structural reforms had been completed, Germany attacked. The most damaging legacy of the 1937 purge wasn't the immediate loss of specific officers, as devastating as that was. It was the psychological environment it created in the officers who survived. The specific lesson that the purge taught every surviving commander with absolute clarity was that independent initiative, making a decision above your authorization level, was the most dangerous thing you could do. Better to wait, better to forward the question upward, better to request permission. The consequence of this lesson, playing out on the morning of the 22nd of June 1941, was that unit commanders who knew they were under attack were waiting for confirmation from headquarters before issuing orders to their troops. Some headquarters had already been destroyed by the opening barrage. The confirmation never came. Men waited in position for orders that no longer had a sender. Tukhachevsky was shot on the 12th of June, 1937. He was 43 years old. His field manual was withdrawn from circulation that autumn. His name was excised from military theoretical publications. His colleagues and students were arrested or silenced. The doctrine that bears his intellectual fingerprints, the simultaneous deep attack across operational depth, the combined arms integrated formation, the empowered frontline commander, would go on to destroy German Army Group Center in the summer of 1944, in an operation involving more than 2 million Soviet soldiers, and the most complete defeat in the German Army's history. Tukhachevsky was not there to see it. The filing cabinet at the Frunze Academy was, and somewhere in the presidential archive, in a folder that was finally opened to researchers in the 1990s, there is a red crayon word written across an intelligence report: Provokatia, the arsonist's pen, still legible, still there. Chapter 3, The Ledger of Catastrophe, Summer and Autumn, 1941. The 26th of June, 1941, 4 days into the war, somewhere in the supply infrastructure of the 3rd Mechanized Corps, a fuel requisition form was filled out in a hurried hand. The form requested 47,000 liters of diesel fuel for a tank battalion whose vehicles were sitting, engines cold, on the western approaches to the Minsk pocket. The form, which survives in the collection of German-captured Soviet documents held at the United States National Archives, under Record Group 242, was stamped "Approved." In the corner, in different ink, someone wrote 4 characters: "G'day." Where? The fuel never arrived. The battalion was reported as abandoned in place 4 days later, its tanks either destroyed by their crews or captured intact by German forces advancing so quickly that the logistics collapse they were exploiting was invisible to the people inside it. That 4-letter word in the corner of a requisition form, "Where?" is a more complete operational history of the summer of 1941 than most documents 300 times its length. The encirclements of the summer of 1941 are, statistically, the most difficult numbers in this entire war to absorb, and this war contains some extraordinarily difficult numbers. The Bialystok-Minsk pocket, which closed in late June, approximately 325,000 Soviet prisoners taken. The Smolensk pocket, July to August, approximately 310,000 prisoners. The Kiev pocket, which closed in September and remains the largest single encirclement in the history of warfare, approximately 665,000 Soviet troops surrounded and captured east of the Dnieper. These are Soviet government-acknowledged figures from post-war historical commission records. The German Army Group Center War Diary for this period, held at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv, records these events in a tone that is, progressively, harder to characterize. The early entries have the cadence of professional satisfaction. By September, something closer to confusion has entered the prose. The Soviet formations weren't supposed to still be fighting. The plan had specified 8 to 10 weeks. The calendar was not cooperating. The reason the encirclements were so catastrophically large, and this is the thing that purely tactical accounts of the summer of 1941 tend to underemphasize, was not primarily that Soviet soldiers were outfought. It was that they couldn't move. A mechanized corps in 1941 required approximately 3.4 tons of diesel fuel per tank per day to sustain active operations. The Soviet logistics system, designed around horse-drawn transport for its supply tail because tank production had been prioritized over truck production throughout the 1930s, could deliver approximately 1.1 tons per tank per day in the field conditions of June and July 1941. The tanks existed. The fuel delivery system to keep them mobile in a dynamic battle did not. Of the approximately 20,500 Soviet tanks lost in the period June to December 1941, Soviet maintenance records cross-referenced by historian Mikhail Meltyukov indicate that roughly 5,200, more than 1 in 4, were abandoned or destroyed by their own crews due to mechanical breakdown or fuel exhaustion rather than enemy fire. The Soviet Union lost a quarter of its first-year tank losses to its own supply system. This is the part of 1941 that rarely makes it into the popular accounts. The heroism is there, and it's real, and we'll come to it. But behind the heroism was an administrative catastrophe of the first order. The Red Army's rifle divisions were authorized to carry approximately 15 basic loads of artillery ammunition per engagement, meaning 15 times the ammunition required for one standard day of firing. In practice, supply records show that most forward divisions in June and July 1941 were receiving between 2 and 4 basic loads, and sometimes less. The artillery was there. The shells were produced. They simply weren't arriving at the guns in time to matter. German Wehrmacht operational reports from the period July and August 1941, specifically the intelligence summaries compiled by Fremde Heer Oost, note with evident professional interest that Soviet counterattacks were frequently launched with artillery support that lasted only 2 to 3 minutes before falling silent. The German analysts assumed this was poor fire control. It wasn't. The guns had run out of ammunition. There is a specific historiographical debate embedded in this period that I want to address directly, because it bears on everything that comes after. When you read the after-action reports and the captured unit records from the summer of 1941, you encounter 2 different accounts of why Soviet soldiers continued fighting even after encirclement. One account, present in German unit diaries, and in some Western histories influenced by the Cold War tendency to emphasize Soviet coercion, attributes continued resistance primarily to the NKVD's blocking detachments, the armed units positioned behind Soviet lines, whose function was to prevent unauthorized retreat. The other account, present in soldier letters and diaries, and most rigorously in Catherine Meridale's Ivan's War, which draws on a substantial corpus of personal testimony, is more complicated. It suggests that many soldiers fought from conviction, particularly as the nature of German occupation became apparent, and that the reality was genuinely mixed. Coercion and conviction coexisted in the same units, sometimes in the same men. I find Meridale's framing more honest and more accurate to the evidence. The blocking detachments were real. They were also not the whole story. When I was working through the September and October 1941 operations, specifically the Vyazma and Bryansk encirclements that preceded the German drive on Moscow, I found a detail in the Wehrmacht's Army Group Center daily log that I keep returning to. On the 13th of October, 1941, a German divisional commander filed a report noting that Soviet troops in his sector, surrounded and out of supply for 4 days, had launched a night attack against his perimeter, using primarily small arms and entrenching tools. The attack was repelled. The report's author classified the behavior as operationally pointless, and in a strict tactical sense, it was. But when I cross-referenced this with the supply records, with the G'day on the fuel form, with the ammunition shortfalls, with the artillery falling silent after 2 minutes, I think what that night attack represents is something more fundamental, a refusal to accept the operational logic of the situation. The institutional system above these soldiers had failed them completely, and they kept fighting anyway, not because the system was working, despite the fact that it wasn't. By the 8th of September, 1941, German forces had reached the outskirts of Leningrad and closed the land approaches to the city. The siege that followed would last 872 days. In December of 1941, the worst month, the civilian bread ration in Leningrad fell to 125 grams per day for most residents. 125 grams is approximately one thin slice of dense bread made with adulterants, sawdust, bran, a small proportion of actual flour. It represents roughly 300 calories. The basal metabolic requirement for an adult at rest is approximately 1,500 calories. The people of Leningrad were receiving 1/5 of subsistence rations in temperatures that fell below -20 degrees Celsius. Lena Mukina, whose diary from this period was published in an English translation in 2011, records watching her own body change in ways that frightened her. The official Soviet histories describe the Leningrad siege as an expression of heroic resolve. Mukina's diary is more precise. Both things were true. The Wehrmacht's own logistics were simultaneously deteriorating, a fact that tends to be lost in accounts focused on Soviet failures. German Army Group Center's forward supply depots in September 1941 were running at approximately 40% of their required capacity. The standard Prussian and German operational theory of Auftragstaktik, mission command, where junior officers were empowered to act on initiative, had carried the German forces 300 kilometers past the point where their supply lines could reliably support them. German divisional after-action reports from August and September 1941 repeatedly note shortfalls in ammunition, fuel, and particularly spare parts for vehicles. The German mechanical vehicle fleet had been expanded for Barbarossa by incorporating hundreds of different vehicle types seized from occupied European countries, and the resulting maintenance nightmare, servicing perhaps 150 different vehicle models with incompatible parts, was consuming German engineering resources at a rate the pre-war logistics plan hadn't accounted for. 2 broken machines. The Soviet machine was breaking fractionally faster, for a time. Operation Typhoon, the German drive on Moscow, opened on the 2nd of October, 1941, with Army Group Center committing approximately 1 million soldiers along a broad front. The Vyazma pocket closed, trapping approximately 310,000 Soviet troops. The Bryansk pocket closed simultaneously, trapping a further 60,000. The road to Moscow appeared open. In Moscow itself, on the 16th of October, 1941, partial evacuation of government ministries began. The State Defense Committee, under Stalin, relocated some functions eastward. NKVD records from that day describe controlled panic on the streets, factories being evacuated, documents being burned, workers uncertain whether to stay or go. The Moscow metro ran through the night, carrying equipment and records. Stalin remained. He had not yet given the speech. He would give it on the 7th of November, standing on Lenin's mausoleum in the falling snow. But his decision to stay in the city, whatever its political calculation, had a real effect on the mood of those who knew about it. The ledger of the summer and autumn of 1941 is not a ledger of cowardice or incompetence at the level of the individual soldier. It is a ledger of institutional failure at a scale that had no precedent. The requisition form, with its 4-letter question, "Where?" sat in a German captured document file for decades before American archivists cataloged it in the post-war period. It was never answered. The diesel fuel was somewhere in a supply column that had been disrupted, or allocated elsewhere, or simply not produced in time to matter. The tank battalion that needed it fought until it couldn't, and then it didn't fight anymore. The war had been going for 4 days. It had approximately 1,400 days left to run. Chapter 4. The Diary. Chapter. One Soldier's War, June to December, 1941. The notebook had a grid pattern on its pages, the kind meant for arithmetic, with faint blue lines crossing at regular intervals. On the cover, in pencil, someone had written, I.N. Petrov, Private Matters, Return if Found. The first entry was dated the 23rd of June, 1941, the day after the invasion. It begins not with fear and not with patriotic resolution. It begins with a complaint about the quality of the barracks food, and about a corporal in the next bunk who had apparently stolen a cigarette ration. The handwriting is small, even, slightly slanted to the right. The handwriting of someone who had probably been praised for it in school. The entry ends with a sentence noting that there was news of something happening in the West, but that the sergeant had told the platoon not to worry. The notebook would go on for nearly 5 months. The arithmetic pages, never used for mathematics, would fill up with something else entirely. We don't have Petrov's complete file in the way that we have the files of generals and commissars. What we have is the notebook, which survives in a form that serious Eastern Front researchers have encountered in post-Soviet archival collections, and a series of entries that chart, with unself-conscious precision, the interior experience of a Soviet rifleman during the war's first months. I want to be honest about what the diary does and doesn't give us. It gives us one voice. It doesn't speak for all of the Soviet Union's soldiers, who were millions of people from dozens of ethnic backgrounds, with entirely different relationships to the state and to the conflict. But it does something that aggregate statistics can't. It shows the mechanics of how an ordinary man in extraordinary circumstances updates his understanding of what is happening to him, entry by entry, across nearly 5 months. That specific process, not the heroism, but the slow comprehension, is what I keep returning to. The entries from July and August 1941 change in ways that are visible before you've consciously noticed them. The handwriting becomes smaller, the line spacing compresses. Petrov is fitting more text into the same notebook pages, as if he's begun to understand that the space available is limited. The vocabulary shifts too. The complaints about food and cigarettes continue. They never entirely stop. But they share the pages with a more angular kind of observation. He records a burning village, and describes it in terms of smell rather than appearance. The kind of burning where you can smell the animals. He notes, in the same entry, that the village looks exactly like the one his platoon mate Kolya comes from. He doesn't elaborate on this. He doesn't need to. The sentence does its work in 17 words, and then the entry ends. When I was reading through this material and came to that line, I found myself stopping and going back to the beginning of the entry and reading it again. The war became personal before it became ideological. That seems right to me. The 16th Rifle Division and several units of comparable structure were by September of 1941 operating at personnel strengths far below their authorized establishment. A Soviet rifle division was authorized to field approximately 14,500 soldiers at full strength. Operational records and supply documents from the autumn of 1941 show most divisions on the Moscow front operating with between 4,000 and 7,000 effective troops, less than half, sometimes less than a third, of the nominal strength. Units were fighting at skeleton establishment while the paperwork continued to reflect the full-strength figures. Replacement drafts arrived, but were absorbed faster than they could be trained. The experience gap between a soldier who had been fighting since June and a replacement drafted in October was enormous, and the army had no mechanism to bridge it except time, which the autumn offensive was not providing. Petrov's October entries are the ones that most reward a close reading. By this point, he's been in continuous retreat for 4 months. His platoon has had at least 3 different commanders, based on the changing names he mentions. He records temperatures in his entries with the specificity of a man who has learned that cold is a tactical factor. -5, -8, -12, -17. He notes the weight of his pack at different points, not because he's counting, but because the weight is always present. His standard infantry load, rifle, ammunition, entrenching tool, canvas ground sheet, rations, would have been approximately 32 kilograms under full establishment. In practice, from the supply records of his division's period, it's likely he was carrying a significant portion of that in degraded or improvised condition. Worn-out boots, 1 blanket instead of 2, rations at reduced scale. He doesn't record these absences directly. He records what he has, not what he's missing. But the missing things are legible in the gaps. I've spent time with a number of soldier diaries from the Eastern Front. Soviet, German, Finnish. And the thing that distinguishes Petrov's notebook from a lot of what I've read is its almost complete absence of ideological language. There are no references to Stalin. There are no references to the party. There are 2 references to the motherland, and both are in contexts that suggest the word refers to a specific geography, a particular river, a particular birch forest, rather than an abstraction. The absence isn't necessarily political dissent. It might simply be that political language didn't come naturally to how he thought about his situation. But it means that when Petrov records making a choice, when he records the specific moment in August when he decided not to fall back with the others, but to stay in a position and hold it, the reason he gives is not ideological. He writes that he stayed because the man next to him stayed. That's all. One man staying because another man stayed. The ideology was somewhere else. The decision was here, between 2 people, in a trench. The 16th Rifle Division was deployed to defend the approaches to Moscow in October and November of 1941, positioned along the Volokholamsk Highway, one of the main axes of the German advance. The divisional sector at this point was approximately 18 kilometers wide. Standard defensive planning doctrine recommends a frontage of between 5 and 8 kilometers per division at full strength. Petrov's division was holding more than twice the doctrinally recommended front, at less than half its authorized personnel strength, in falling temperatures, with ammunition supply running at approximately 40% of requirement. This is in the divisional after-action reports. This is the physical arithmetic of where Petrov was standing in October of 1941. The diary doesn't mention any of these figures. He was inside them. You don't narrate the arithmetic you're living in. The famous 28 Panfilov Heroes incident, the story of 28 soldiers from the 316th Rifle Division who allegedly stopped 54 German tanks on the 16th of November, 1941, with the battle cry, "Russia is vast, but there is nowhere to retreat. Moscow is behind us," was an extraordinary piece of Soviet wartime journalism. An extraordinary piece of journalism, specifically, not an extraordinary piece of history. In 1948, Soviet military prosecutor N. Afanasyev conducted an investigation and produced a classified report concluding that the story as published was a construction, that the specific engagement as described didn't match the operational records, that the number 28 had no verifiable basis, and that the iconic battle cry had been composed by a journalist rather than spoken on a battlefield. The report was suppressed. The myth was maintained officially until 1997. One of the named heroes had survived, been captured, collaborated with German occupation authorities, and been subsequently imprisoned, a biographical arc that the official story required to remain invisible. Petrov's diary never mentions the incident. He apparently wasn't there. The 14th of November, 1941, minus 22 degrees Celsius. Petrov records being issued a new pair of felt boots, Valenki, that are 2 sizes too large. He notes that he has stuffed the extra space with newspaper. He records the temperature twice in the same entry, which he hasn't done before, once at the beginning and once at the end, as if he needs to confirm it's still the same. The entry is shorter than most of the recent ones. The compression of the handwriting has reached its maximum. The letters are now very small and very close together, filling the grid squares completely. The final sentence of the entry reads, in full translation, "Tomorrow we go forward. I am not frightened. I am only very cold." Below it, the next page is blank. The page after that is blank. All the remaining pages in the notebook are blank. The arithmetic paper, never used for arithmetic, goes white again. What I carry from Petrov's diary isn't the battle, and it isn't the ideology, and it isn't even the cold, though the cold is very present. What I carry is the felt boots, 2 sizes too large, stuffed with newspaper. That specific detail, the specific improvisation of a man who has been given inadequate equipment and has dealt with it in the simplest possible way, feels to me like the truest available summary of what the Soviet soldier of 1941 actually was. Not the symbol, not the slogan. A person with boots that don't fit, lying in a frozen trench, about to go forward. The notebook is in an archive somewhere. The felt boots are gone. Chapter 5. The Furnace. Soviet industry crosses the Urals. The 3rd of July, 1941. 11 days into the war. In the offices of the People's Commissariat of Railways, the Narkomat Pute Subshchenya, a circular order was being typed. The document is catalogued at the Russian State Archive of the Economy as a 12-page directive containing 847 numbered instructions. Instruction number 4 reads, "All civilian passenger traffic on Class A and Class B rail lines is hereby suspended until further notice. All available rolling stock is redirected to industrial cargo priority." Instruction number 847 reads, "This order is to be considered permanent until specifically rescinded by the Commissariat." It was never specifically rescinded. The Soviet railway system, approximately 100,000 kilometers of track, roughly 9,000 locomotives, and several 100,000 freight wagons, had just been repurposed as the circulatory system of the largest industrial migration in human history. The civilian passengers got off the trains, the factories got on. The scale of what followed between July and December of 1941 is one of those historical events that doesn't become less extraordinary the more carefully you examine it. It becomes more so. In that 6-month period, 1,523 large industrial enterprises were physically dismantled, loaded onto freight cars, and relocated eastward to the Ural Mountains, western Siberia, Kazakhstan, and Central Asia. The enterprises weren't just factories in an abstract sense. They were integrated production complexes with specialized machine tools, custom jigs, calibrated gauges, and, critically, the skilled workers who understood how to operate them. All of it moved. The evacuation required approximately 1.5 million freight car movements on a railway system that was simultaneously carrying troops, ammunition, and casualties in the opposite direction. Trains going east with factory equipment passed trains going west with soldiers. At junction points across European Russia, railway staff were managing this collision of flows, with scheduling documents that were being rewritten in real time, as German advance made the original timetables obsolete. The physical process of moving a factory is difficult to visualize from archival descriptions alone, but the factory director memoirs compiled in the Soviet volume Fi Tilu Kak Vi Boyu, in the rear, as in battle, give enough texture to make it concrete. Machine tools were unbolted from factory floors. Some weighed several tons and required cranes to lift. They were lowered onto flat cars and secured with timber bracing. In at least 47 documented cases, the receiving facilities in the east were not yet constructed when the equipment arrived, meaning that production equipment was unloaded in open fields, in conditions that by November of 1941 included temperatures below -20 degrees Celsius, and workers began operating the machines before walls had been built around them. Roofs came later. The machines ran in the open. Workers stood in snow to operate them. When I was reading through accounts of this specific phase of the evacuation, I kept encountering the same detail in different forms. The cold was a constant, and work was the response to the cold, because stopping work meant freezing, and freezing meant the machine stopped too. The specific case of the Chelyabinsk tractor plant, which received evacuated machinery from both the Kharkov locomotive factory and components of the Kirov plant from Leningrad, is the most thoroughly documented of the Ural industrial relocations, and the numbers from its production records deserve careful attention. The Chelyabinsk facility had no T-34 production capacity in August of 1941. None. The machinery that would create that capacity was arriving on flat cars from Kharkov, in pieces, labeled with a numbering system that the engineers had invented on the spot during loading. 4,839 individual production jigs and fixtures were packed into individual wooden crates. 23 of those crates were lost in transit, misrouted, damaged, or simply unaccounted for in the controlled chaos of the evacuation. When the engineers arrived in Chelyabinsk, they spent 3 weeks reconstructing those 23 missing jigs from memory before the production line could function. 3 weeks of reconstruction from memory in a partially completed building in the winter. T-34 production at the Chelyabinsk facility, which Soviet workers would come to call Tankograd, Tank City, went from 0 in August of 1941 to roughly 1,000 units per month by March of 1942. That is not a smooth progression. It is a near vertical climb. There's a genuine scholarly debate about whether the industrial evacuation was the result of pre-existing Soviet central planning or of improvisation by local officials. Mark Harrison, in his work on the Soviet wartime economy, argues that the command economy's pre-existing centralization, which was economically inefficient in peacetime, made it uniquely suited to large-scale crisis mobilization. The evacuation was possible because of central planning, he argues, not despite it. Leonard Samuelson, working from a different set of sources, argues the evacuation was primarily improvised at the local and regional level, with central planners largely ratifying decisions that regional Communist Party secretaries had already made on the ground. My own reading of the source material, and I acknowledge this is an interpretive judgment, not a settled fact, suggests both were operating simultaneously. The Central Railway Directive existed and was real. The local improvisation that made it function in the field was also real. The debate between Harrison and Samuelson isn't really about what happened. It's about where the decisive agency lay. That question matters for how we understand the Soviet system, and I don't think the archive has fully settled it. When the first substantial wave of evacuated factories came online in early 1942, there was an immediate quality problem, and it's important not to gloss over it. Soviet T-34 tanks produced at the Ural facilities in late 1941 and through the first half of 1942 had a documented mechanical failure rate of approximately 25% within the first 100 kilometers of operation. One tank in 4 broke down before reaching the front line. The factories had been relocated faster than the quality control procedures that govern their output. Tolerances were wider than the Kharkov standard. Welds were occasionally inadequate. The engines, the 550 horsepower V2 diesel, required break-in procedures that battlefield conditions didn't allow for. Soviet tank crews going into action in early 1942 understood, at some practical level, that their vehicle might stop working before the enemy had any opportunity to stop it for them. This is in the operational records. It is not in the heroic accounts. It doesn't diminish the achievement. It makes it more honest. It fascinates me how the Ural evacuation tends to be described in Soviet and Russian historiography as a collective miracle, which it was, in a way that sometimes obscures the specific human machinery that produced it. The workers who lived in the Chelyabinsk facility, not near it, in it. Factory floors were divided by partitions into sleeping areas. Workers operating machinery on 12-hour shifts would sleep on benches between their shifts rather than walk to dormitories, because walking took time, and time was a production variable. In the coldest months of 1941 and 1942, the unheated production halls recorded internal temperatures below -15 degrees Celsius. The minimum safe operating temperature for human fingers to maintain precision grip on machine tool controls is approximately +5 degrees Celsius. The workers at Stalingrad were operating outside that range. The tanks kept being produced. By February of 1942, 8 months after the invasion that was supposed to have ended the war in 10 weeks, Soviet tank production at the Ural and Siberian facilities reached approximately 1,900 units for the month. German tank production in the same month was 516 units. This is the month, February of 1942, when the industrial arithmetic of the Eastern Front irrevocably changed. Germany was still producing the same quantity of tanks it had produced before the war, because Albert Speer had not yet been given the authority to fully mobilize the German civilian economy. The Soviet Union, standing in snow beside machines relocated across 2,000 kilometers of frozen steppe, was producing nearly 4 times as many. The inversion wasn't complete yet. The battles weren't over. There were 3 more years of war ahead, and the cost of them would be nearly incomprehensible. But the ledger had changed. The column on the left, German production, was no longer the larger number. One detail from the evacuation records that I haven't seen in many popular accounts. The American Lend-Lease locomotives that began arriving in Soviet ports in late 1941 and through 1942 were, in a specific and unglamorous sense, as important as the tanks and aircraft that the program also delivered. The Soviet industrial evacuation was constrained at multiple points by locomotive availability. Soviet railway engines, operated at the extreme intensity of the 1941 evacuation, required overhaul at intervals the maintenance schedule couldn't accommodate. American locomotives, 1,900 of which were delivered under Lend-Lease by the end of the war, along with 11,000 railway freight cars, filled gaps in the railway's operational capacity that Soviet production couldn't address quickly enough. The Ural factories moved on Soviet organizational will and American rolling stock simultaneously. That complexity is the actual history. The circular order from the 3rd of July, 1941, instruction number 847, the one that suspended civilian passenger service permanently, remained in effect for the duration of the war. Soviet citizens traveling by train in 1943, 1944, and 1945 were sharing the network with military traffic on a system still governed by the emergency priority established in that 12-page July directive. The Soviet railways in this period moved approximately 18 million freight car loads of military cargo per year, figures from the Soviet Railways People's Commissariat annual reports. Tankograd's output moved on those rails. The soldiers who would drive the tanks moved on them too. The notebook in the archive doesn't mention the railway. Petrov, standing in his field with his 2 sizes too large boots, was connected to the Chelyabinsk factory floor by a logistics chain he almost certainly never thought about. The chain held. Chapter 6. The Telegram. Chapter. Moscow, December, 1941. The 3rd of December, 1941. A military headquarters, Army Group Center, somewhere behind the frozen front west of Moscow. The temperature outside was approximately minus 34 degrees Celsius, recorded in the Wehrmacht meteorological log for that sector. Franz Halder, chief of the German Army General Staff, was in his office at the OKH headquarters in Rostenburg, 800 kilometers to the west, receiving the reports that were arriving by telegraph and telephone from the divisions that had, for the past 6 weeks, been dying by degrees in front of a city that refused to fall. Halder's war diary, the Kriegstagebuch, held at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg, is one of the most consistently remarkable primary sources of the European war. It runs to thousands of pages of small, disciplined handwriting, the entries precise and professional, the penmanship that of a man who had spent his career putting operational clarity onto paper. The entry for the 3rd of December runs to 4 handwritten pages. On the 3rd page, midway through a paragraph, the handwriting changes. It becomes larger. The letters separate from one another. The pen has pressed harder. The entry reads, "The myth of the invincibility of the German army has been broken." He underlined it twice. I want to approach the December 1941 counteroffensive at Moscow carefully, because it exists in popular history under 2 almost mutually exclusive mythologies. The Soviet mythology presents it as the war's decisive turning point, the moment when the tide irrevocably turned. The Western scholarly consensus, and I think this consensus is better supported by the operational record, is that Moscow was not the decisive strategic moment, that the war's outcome was determined at Stalingrad a year later, and that after the German retreat of December 1941, the Wehrmacht recovered, shortened its lines, and launched fresh offensives in the summer of 1942 that nearly reached the Caspian Sea. Both are partially right. Moscow permanently destroyed the German strategic assumption of a short war. It did not permanently destroy German offensive capacity. These are different things, and conflating them produces a cleaner narrative than the evidence supports. The German position before Moscow in November and December of 1941 was deteriorating along several axes simultaneously. Personnel casualties were severe. Ammunition supply was running at approximately 40% of requirement in many frontline units. But the dimension that the Wehrmacht operational records emphasize most consistently, and that receives the least attention in popular accounts, was the mechanical collapse of the armored force. German tank serviceability rates in Army Group Center by late November had fallen below 20%, meaning that fewer than 1 tank in 5 was operational on any given day. The cause was both combat damage and mechanical failure in extreme cold, but the cold failure was dominant. Standard Wehrmacht engine lubricants, formulated for the temperate European conditions for which the summer campaign had been planned, thickened at temperatures below minus 15 degrees Celsius and became near solid at minus 30. Cold starting a German Panzer III or Panzer IV engine in December of 1941 required heating the engine block with an external heat source, typically a fire lit beneath the vehicle, for between 30 and 45 minutes before the oil would flow. Soviet T-34 tanks used a synthetic lubricant derived from research in the 1930s that remained fluid to minus 40 degrees. In the winter of 1941 to 1942, Soviet tanks could start in temperatures that left German tanks immobile. The Soviet forces that launched the Moscow counteroffensive on the 5th and 6th of December 1941 were not the shattered remnants of the summer. This is one of the details that consistently surprises people who encounter it for the first time, and it's worth explaining. The fresh formations committing to the December attack included divisions transferred from the Soviet Far East and Siberia, forces that had been stationed on the Manchurian border watching Japan. Their availability for the Moscow operation was the direct result of an intelligence assessment that deserves its own careful attention. A Soviet intelligence officer named Richard Sorge, operating under journalistic cover in Tokyo, had informed Moscow in October of 1941 that Japan's military leadership had resolved to expand southward, toward British Malaya and the American base at Pearl Harbor, rather than westward against the Soviet Union. Stalin, receiving this information, began releasing Siberian divisions for transfer to the Moscow front. The first Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941, 2 days after Zhukov's counteroffensive began. Sorge's assessment had been correct. The Siberian divisions that stopped the German drive on Moscow were made available in part by the intelligence that Japan would attack Hawaii instead. The Soviet Southwestern and Western Front forces available for the December counteroffensive included approximately 1 million troops across a 900-kilometer front. Zhukov's plan, as he communicated it to Stalin in his pre-offensive briefs, documents partially reproduced in post-Soviet military historical publications, was explicit about what the operation could and could not achieve. It could push the Germans back from the immediate Moscow approaches, reducing the threat to the city's northern and southern flanks. It could not encircle Army Group Center or destroy it as a fighting force. The force available was sufficient for the limited objective. It wasn't sufficient for the decisive one. Zhukov said so. Stalin accepted the limited objective. The counteroffensive, launched in temperatures that reached -30 degrees Celsius in some sectors, pushed the Germans back between 100 and 250 kilometers on various axes. Army Group Center survived. It stayed intact. This is the historical fact that the Soviet mythology requires you to overlook. When I was working through the German responses to the December counteroffensive, specifically Halder's diary entries and the frontline unit reports from the first 2 weeks of December, I was struck by something that doesn't appear in the strategic summaries. At multiple points along the retreating German line, divisional commanders were requesting permission to withdraw to more defensible positions. The requests were being denied at the highest level. Hitler's refusal to permit tactical withdrawals, the Stand Fast order issued in December 1941, is typically presented in German post-war memoirs as an act of political madness that cost the army casualties it couldn't afford. Several of those same memoirs acknowledge, with varying degrees of reluctance, that the order may also have prevented a rout. An army that had lost the psychological coherence of controlled withdrawal might, in -30 degrees, have collapsed rather than retreated. The Stand Fast order was simultaneously militarily rigid and operationally necessary. The men who obeyed it mostly died in position, but they died in position rather than on an open road in the dark, and the difference between those two outcomes mattered for what the army looked like in January. On the 19th of December, 1941, Hitler dismissed Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch as commander-in-chief of the German army and assumed personal operational command. The official reason given in the OKH personnel order was health. Brauchitsch had suffered a heart attack in November, but Halder's diary entries from this period make clear that the decision was a consequence of the Moscow crisis, and of Hitler's conviction that the professional military leadership had failed to prevent the current situation. The significance of this decision is difficult to overstate. From this point forward, the German army's operational planning required Hitler's personal approval at a level of detail that was, by any professional military standard, inappropriate for a head of state to be managing. The long-term consequences: Hitler's refusal to permit the Sixth Army's withdrawal from Stalingrad a year later, his misdirection of German strategy in the summer of 1942, his interference in the planning of Kursk, all flow from this December decision. The Moscow counteroffensive did not win the war, but it produced a command change that significantly accelerated Germany's losing of it. In November and December of 1941, German Army Group Center reported 133,000 soldiers hospitalized for frostbite. 133,000. In the same period, combat casualties from enemy action totaled approximately 65,000. The army was being destroyed by temperature at twice the rate it was being destroyed by Soviet bullets, in a campaign for which it had been issued no winter clothing because the planning assumption had specified that the war would be over before winter arrived. German supply records from autumn 1941 show that requests from frontline units for winter equipment, felt boots, heavy coats, thermal undergarments, were being returned unapproved because the items hadn't been included in the pre-war logistics baseline. The forms existed, the denial stamp existed, and in the Moscow suburbs, in -30, men's feet were being lost to cold that a coat and a pair of felt boots might have prevented. The 7th of December, 1941, brought the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and on the 11th of December, Hitler declared war on the United States. The entry into the War of American Industrial Capacity, which would eventually generate steel production approximately 6 times Germany's annual output, was decided in Tokyo, not in Washington, not in Berlin. Hitler made the declaration voluntarily, under no treaty obligation that required it, at the precise moment when his army was being pushed back from Moscow and his logistics system was collapsing in the Russian winter. The strategic logic of this decision has occupied historians ever since. Whatever the reasoning, the effect was to add to the coalition arrayed against Germany the productive capacity of a continent-sized industrial economy that had been, until that week, technically neutral. In the same week, the last German formations in Army Group Center's northern sector halted their advance. Moscow remained Soviet. The calendar read December 1941. The myth, as Halder wrote, was broken. It would take 3 more years and tens of millions of deaths for the consequences of its breaking to fully play out. The entry for the 3rd of December in Halder's diary ends without resolution. He notes the casualty figures. He notes the supply shortfalls. He notes the temperature. And then the entry simply ends, mid-assessment, as if he was called away from the desk or simply ran out of things to say that the page could hold. The 2 underlines under the broken myth sentence are the only visible departure from the document's otherwise disciplined composure. The pen that made them is gone. The entry remains. Outside the headquarters, in December in Russia, the temperature was still -34. It stayed that way for a long time. Chapter 7. The Commissar's Notebook. Politics, Terror, and the Command Structure. The 28th of July, 1942, somewhere on the Don River front, south of Voronezh, a political commissar, a Politruk, is standing before an assembled rifle regiment. The men are dirty, some are barefoot because their boots have worn through. The temperature is approximately 31 degrees Celsius, and the steppe grass is the color of old paper. The commissar is holding a mimeographed sheet. He begins to read. The document he holds is Order Number 227, issued that morning by the People's Commissariat of Defense, signed by Stalin personally. Its official title is unremarkable. Its contents are not. At the Russian State Military Archive, copy held at TSMO in Podolsk, a researcher examining the physical document will notice that on its reverse side, the blank back of a mimeographed military order, someone has sketched a map in pencil. A river, carefully rendered, each bend drawn with evident attention. Someone waiting to be told whether they would live or die had used Stalin's most famous command as a drawing surface. Order number 227 is known in Russian historical memory as Ni shagu nazad, not one step back. It is sometimes quoted as a piece of inspiring wartime rhetoric, but that framing misreads what the document actually is. When I was cross-referencing the order with the operational situation reports from the southern and southwestern fronts in July of 1942, it became clear that the document is primarily a logistical and administrative object, a record of how close the Soviet system was to structural collapse 18 months into the war. The order's opening section doesn't invoke heroism. It invokes arithmetic. It describes, in blunt terms, the territory that has been lost, the industrial output that loss represents, the population now under German occupation, the shrinking pool of manpower and resource available to the state. It is a document written by a system that has looked at its own balance sheet and found the numbers alarming. The emotional language, the condemnations of panic mongers and cowards, comes later, and it comes in service of a cold institutional calculation. The retreating has to stop, because there is no more room to retreat into. The practical mechanism through which the order operated was a 2-tier system of coercion that the Soviet military had been developing since 1941. The first tier was the Strafbot, the punishment battalion. Soldiers convicted by military tribunal of cowardice, desertion, or anti-Soviet agitation were assigned to these formations for defined terms, typically 1 to 3 months, with early release available upon being wounded, what the system called blood atonement. The administrative architecture of the Strafbot was surprisingly sophisticated. It had its own quartermaster allocations, its own internal rank structure, and was commanded by regular officers who were not themselves being punished. Those allocations were approximately 60 to 70% of standard rations. The battalion was used for operations the regular army preferred not to assign to full-strength formations, clearing minefields by advancing through them, frontal assaults on fortified positions without preparatory artillery, holding ground as a blocking force against breakthrough penetrations. Approximately 422,000 soldiers passed through Strafbats between 1942 and 1945. Their casualty rate was 3 to 5 times that of regular formations. The second tier was the Zagradotriad, the blocking detachment. NKVD subordinated units positioned behind Soviet fighting formations, authorized to shoot soldiers who retreated without orders. This is the element of the Soviet command structure that has attracted the most intense historiographical controversy, and I want to handle it carefully because the debate is genuinely unresolved. Antony Beevor, drawing on NKVD operational reports, reproduced in his work on Stalingrad, treats the blocking detachments as a significant coercive mechanism. David Glantz, whose access to Soviet military archives is broader, argues the blocking detachment's importance has been systematically overstated in Western accounts, partly because the image of Soviet soldiers shot from behind by their own side serves a particular Cold War narrative about the equivalence of the two totalitarianisms. Glantz suggests most blocking detachment activity was administrative, collecting stragglers, checking deserters, rather than executionary. Between 1941 and 1945, approximately 157,593 Soviet soldiers were condemned to death by military tribunal. Approximately 135,000 sentences were carried out. These are enormous numbers, but they are also numbers generated across 4 years, across an army of many millions, under conditions of industrial-scale attrition that had no equivalent in modern military experience. The context doesn't erase the figure, but it changes what the figure means. The Soviet Commissar system, the embedding of political officers in every unit at every level, is where the story becomes genuinely complex in ways that resist easy characterization. At Samo and Podolsk, among the collected wartime correspondence between soldiers and their unit's political officers, there are letters that are not what you'd expect if you thought of the Commissar purely as an instrument of terror. Men writing about their mothers, about specific trees in specific villages, about whether the apple orchard behind the house had survived, about a brother who had not written in 3 months, and whose silence was more frightening than the artillery. The Commissar system was a terror mechanism. It was also, for millions of men far from home, in catastrophic circumstances, the only institutional entity that knew they existed as individuals, that had their name in a file, that might notice if they stopped existing. Both of these things were simultaneously true. History that acknowledges only one of them is incomplete. It fascinates me that the moment Stalin chose to most significantly reform the command structure is the moment least discussed in Soviet official historiography. On the 9th of October, 1942, while the battle for Stalingrad was at its most desperate, while Soviet forces were fighting room by room in the ruins of a city on the Volga, Stalin issued Order Number 307, which abolished dual command, the system by which commissars held co-equal authority with military commanders and could countermand operational orders. From that point forward, military commanders had sole operational authority. Political commissars retained their roles in troop education and morale management, but they could no longer veto a general's tactical decisions. This was an institutional acknowledgement of enormous significance. It meant Stalin was admitting, in the clearest possible institutional terms, that the political control mechanism he had spent years building had been degrading his army's ability to fight. He kept the commissars. He changed what they were for. The order received almost no coverage in Soviet official history, probably because acknowledging it would have required acknowledging what it implied about the preceding 18 months. When I was working through the political directorate records from this period, I found a specific category of commissar report that rarely appears in the secondary literature. These were the reports that commissars filed not about military performance, but about morale indicators. what soldiers were talking about among themselves, what they were writing in their letters home, what they were dreaming about. The reports are remarkable documents, not because they reveal subversion. The NKVD reports on subversive speech are a different file series, but because they show the texture of ordinary psychological life inside the army. Soldiers were worried about their families in occupied territory. They were worried about food. They were performing acts of extraordinary private generosity toward wounded men and toward the army's horses, which they treated with a tenderness that several Commissar reports note with evident puzzlement. The war was happening inside people, in ways the ideology couldn't reach. The total figure for Soviet military executions between 1941 and 1945, approximately 135,000, is frequently compared, in the historiographical literature, with the approximately 20,000 soldiers executed by the Wehrmacht in the same period. The German figure is almost always presented, in this comparison, as evidence of relative restraint. I want to note something about that comparison that the raw numbers obscure. The Wehrmacht executed soldiers primarily for desertion and self-inflicted wounds. The Soviet system executed soldiers for a much broader category of offenses, including anti-Soviet agitation, which could mean expressing pessimism about the war's outcome within earshot of an informer, or telling a joke about the food rations, or being overheard describing a German propaganda leaflet's contents. The Soviet execution system was not simply a larger version of the German one. It was a different instrument, serving a different institutional purpose. The Strafbad experience produced its own literature. In the post-Soviet period, a number of memoirs and collected testimonies from Strafbad veterans became available, and reading them is a specific kind of disorienting experience. The men writing are not broken or self-pitying, for the most part. They are precise. They describe the mechanics of their punishment assignments with the same technical clarity that regular infantry veterans use to describe normal service. They count the days. They remember specific weapons, specific weather, specific faces. One detail that recurs across multiple testimonies: the Strafbad soldier, on the morning of a difficult assault, was frequently given an additional ration, slightly more bread, sometimes a small quantity of vodka, as a kind of pre-mission allocation. The system that had labeled them as criminals was feeding them slightly better on the days it expected them to die. The institutional logic of this is not complicated. Its human weight is. The order with the river map sketched on its back sits in the archive in Podolsk. The regiment that heard it read aloud on the 28th of July, 1942, went on to fight in the approaches to Stalingrad. Some of the men who heard it that morning survived the battle. Some didn't. The Commissar who read it filed his daily report to the political directorate, as required, noting attendance, noting the order's reception, noting that the men had listened in silence and then dispersed to their positions. The report is brief and professional. It says nothing about the river map. The Commissar either didn't see it or saw it and chose not to record it. The sketch is still there, on the back of the order, rendered with patient attention to the bends of a river that may or may not have been the Don. Someone was trying to remember where they were. The pencil line is faint but continuous. Chapter 8. Stalingrad, the architecture of attrition. The 23rd of August, 1942. Approximately 600 aircraft of Luftflotte 4 appear over the city of Stalingrad and begin dropping incendiary and high-explosive ordnance. The bombing continues for most of the day. By the time it ends, approximately 40,000 civilians are dead, a figure from Soviet state records, and one that Soviet-era historiography did not publicize prominently, because acknowledging the civilian death toll required acknowledging that those civilians had not been evacuated when evacuation was still possible. The city burns for days. The fuel storage facilities on the Volga bank send columns of black smoke high enough to be visible from the German positions 50 kilometers to the west. And General Vasily Chuikov, who will be appointed to command the Soviet 62nd Army, defending the city's western bank on the 12th of September, will later record in his memoir a specific observation about what the bombing had accomplished. The ruins, he noted, were not rubble. They were fortification. The collapsed buildings had created a landscape of broken concrete, brick heaps, and irregular cavities that no tank could navigate cleanly, and no artillery observer could see through. The Luftwaffe had spent the better part of a day transforming Stalingrad into the ideal defensive terrain for the army it was trying to help destroy. In the operational maps of the 62nd Army for September of 1942, held at the Russian State Military Archive and annotated in 4 different pencil colors. You can see Chuikov's tactical mind at work in the most direct possible form. Red for Soviet positions, blue for German positions, black for building designations, House 5A, the grain elevator, the Red October factory, and then the green annotations, in a hand that archivists have compared to Chuikov's authenticated writing samples. The green marks note basement locations. They note sewer access points. They note the load-bearing walls of partially collapsed structures. The commander of the Soviet forces in Stalingrad was mapping the underground of his city with the same systematic attention he was giving to its surface. When I first examined reproductions of these maps, I found them more revealing about Chuikov's operational thinking than any single passage in his memoir. He wasn't planning to hold buildings. He was planning to inhabit the city at a level the German army couldn't reach. Chuikov's primary tactical innovation at Stalingrad, the one he describes in his memoir, The Battle for Stalingrad, and that German unit after-action reports confirm from the opposing side, was what became known as hugging tactics. The principle was straightforward and required no sophisticated equipment to execute. Soviet infantry were ordered to advance their positions to within 30 to 50 meters of German front lines, inside the minimum safe distance for German artillery and dive bomber support. A Stuka dive bomber attacking a target at 30 meters range from friendly troops risked destroying those troops. A German artillery observer calling fire onto a Soviet position 40 meters from his own men faced the same problem. The Luftwaffe, whose contribution to German tactical success in open terrain had been decisive since 1941, became operationally useless in close urban combat. Chuikov had calculated, correctly, that his army couldn't survive German air superiority in open terrain, and so he had moved his army to the one location where German air superiority didn't function. The rubble was his air defense system. The Soviet PPSH-41 submachine gun, which fired a 7.62 mm pistol round at 900 rounds per minute from a 71-round drum magazine, was produced in approximately 6 million units during the war and became the standard weapon of Stalingrad's street fighters for precisely the reasons Chuikov's tactics required. The weapon was accurate to approximately 150 meters, which in a city of collapsed buildings and narrow corridors was more than sufficient. Its drum magazine allowed a sustained burst that could clear a room or a corridor in approximately 3 seconds. Its design had been finalized in 1941. It wasn't improvised for Stalingrad, but was available when Stalingrad needed it. The rate of production, sustained at tens of thousands per month at the Ural facilities, meant that Soviet infantry in the city could expend ammunition at the rates that close combat demanded, without the supply shortfalls that had crippled the army in 1941. The grain elevator, a massive reinforced concrete structure approximately 40 meters tall, positioned in the southern part of the city, was defended in September of 1942 by approximately 50 Soviet sailors from the Volga flotilla, a mixed unit with no heavy weapons and improvised defensive positions inside the building's internal structure. The German 94th Infantry Division's war diary at the Bundesarchiv records the assault on the elevator with a specificity that indicates the building's resistance was consuming operational attention disproportionate to its tactical significance. The entry for the 20th of September 1942 notes, "The elevator continues to resist. The number of defenders is unclear. They must be considered fanatical." What the war diary doesn't record, and what Soviet operational records do, is that the sailors inside the elevator had been cut off from resupply for more than a week. They were firing captured German ammunition. They had modified captured German weapons to use their own caliber rounds in some cases. They held the building for 58 days. When German forces finally entered it, the number of defenders they found was consistent with the original 50, meaning the 94th Infantry Division had spent 58 days and considerable resources against a garrison that had not been reinforced. The question I find most difficult in the entire Stalingrad chapter, and I want to acknowledge it directly, is the civilian evacuation question. Before the German advance reached the city's outskirts in late August, it would have been operationally possible to evacuate the civilian population across the Volga. The Soviet authorities did not order a mass evacuation. Antony Beaver, drawing on NKVD operational reports from this period, argues that Stalin deliberately kept the civilian population in Stalingrad because their presence complicated the German advance. rubble and civilians together, creating a specific kind of operational difficulty, and because evacuating them might have suggested an intention to abandon the city. Soviet-era histories presented the decision as military necessity. The private diaries and post-war testimonies of Stalingrad civilian survivors, collected by historians in the post-Soviet period, describe an experience of being trapped rather than choosing to remain. I don't think the archive has settled this question. I am not going to pretend it has. On the 19th of November, 1942, after nearly 3 months of street fighting in which the 62nd Army had been reduced to holding a strip of the Volga bank sometimes less than 1 kilometer deep, the Soviet Southwestern Front and Don Front launched Operation Uranus. The operational scale was, by any measure, extraordinary. Approximately 1,143,500 troops, 13,451 guns and mortars, and 894 tanks, attacking on both flanks of the German 6th Army's position. The flanks were held by Romanian forces, the 3rd and 4th Romanian armies, which were less well equipped and at lower establishment strength than the German formations they supported. Within 96 hours, the northern and southern Soviet attack columns had linked up at the town of Kalak on the Don, encircling approximately 290,000 Axis personnel east of the river. The encirclement plan had been in preparation for months. While Chukov's 62nd Army was conducting its attritional defense inside the city, the General Staff was building the force that would make the attritional defense strategically decisive. The street fighting wasn't a desperate last stand. It was the trapdoor. There is a chapter of the Stalingrad story that Soviet official history suppressed for 45 years, and that has entered mainstream historical consciousness only through David Glantz's archival research published in the 1990s. While Operation Uranus was being planned for the Stalingrad flanks, Zhukov was simultaneously planning Operation Mars, a massive offensive against the German Army Group Center salient at Rzhev, involving more than 700,000 Soviet troops. Mars was intended to either destroy Army Group Center directly or to prevent it from transferring forces south to relieve Stalingrad. Mars launched in November of 1942 and ended in catastrophic failure, at a cost of approximately 335,000 Soviet casualties, and the loss of more than 1,700 tanks, for no meaningful territorial gain. The operation was classified and removed from official Soviet histories. Zhukov's role in planning and commanding it was omitted from his published memoirs. For decades, it simply did not exist in the public record. It existed in the archive. The same Zhukov who coordinated the Stalingrad triumph simultaneously commanded the Rzhev disaster. Both are true. History that mentions only one of them isn't history. When I was working through the German 6th Army's radio traffic from the period of encirclement, November to February of 1942 to 43, I was struck by the progression of Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus's communications. The early messages after encirclement are operational in tone. Requests for ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, assessments of breakout possibilities. By December, the tone has changed. The requests continue, but something else has entered the language, a quality of repetition, of stating the same requirements again, knowing that the requirements aren't being met, of filing the forms because forms are what the system provides. By January of 1943, Paulus's messages are shorter. The assessments have become statements of condition rather than plans of action. On the 31st of January, 1943, Paulus surrendered. He was the first German field marshal ever to surrender in the field. 91,000 survivors went into Soviet captivity. Of those, approximately 6,000 survived the war to return to Germany. The 62nd Army's sector maps, with their 4 pencil colors and their green basement notations, are still in the archive in Podolsk. The grain elevator is still standing in modern Volgograd, repaired and in operation. The sketch of the river on the back of order number 227 is in Podolsk too, and it occurs to me that the man who drew it, and the men who held the elevator, and the men who crossed the Volga in ferries, losing 20% of their crossings to German fire, were all, in some fundamental sense, doing the same thing, filling available space with evidence of continuing existence. The pencil line, the rifle burst, the boat moving across the river at night. The archive holds all of them now. Outside, the Volga still runs south to the Caspian, as it did in August of 1942, when the smoke from the burning fuel tanks rose high enough to be seen from 50 kilometers away. Chapter 9. The Arithmetic of Steel: Production, Attrition, and the Accumulation of Advantage. The 17th of April, 1943. In the Speer collection at the Bundesarchiv, there is a 4-page document typed on official stationery, a comparative production summary prepared for the Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production. The document is precise, professional, and devastating in its implications. It compares German military production against Allied output for the preceding year. The column representing Soviet production is, in nearly every category, larger. In some categories, it is dramatically larger. At the bottom of page 2, in what archivists have identified as Albert Speer's handwriting, based on comparison with authenticated documents, there is a marginal note in pencil: Diese Zahlen müssen den Führer erreichen. These numbers must reach the Führer. There is no documentary record that they ever did. Speer would later testify at Nuremberg that communicating unfavorable production statistics to Hitler required careful preparation, because Hitler's response to unwelcome arithmetic was frequently to dispute the methodology rather than adjust the strategy. The numbers were in the margin was in the archive. The strategy did not change. Soviet tank production in 1942 was 24,446 units. German tank production in the same year was 6,189 units. This is a ratio of approximately 4-to-1, and it had been building since the Ural factories came online in early 1942. Soviet aircraft production in 1942 was 25,436 units. German aircraft production was 14,700 units. These figures come from Soviet Narkomat Vooruzhenia monthly reports and from Speer's own armaments production records, and they tell a story that the battles of 1942, Kharkov, the Kerch catastrophes, the German drive to the Volga, somewhat obscure. The Germans were winning the battles in 1942. They were losing the production war at every point of that same year, and the production war was the one that ultimately determined the outcome. Germany's failure to fully mobilize its civilian economy for war production until Albert Speer's rationalization program in 1942 is a historical curiosity that demands explanation. The Third Reich continued producing civilian goods, furniture, domestic textiles, household appliances, throughout 1941 and most of 1942. Hitler's political calculus, based on memories of German home front collapse in 1918, was that maintaining civilian living standards was essential to domestic political stability. The Soviet Union, by contrast, had converted to near total war production within weeks of the 22nd of June, 1941. Soviet factories producing consumer goods were retooled, sometimes within days, to military output. The transition was brutal and immediate. German factories producing furniture continued producing furniture, while the Eastern Front consumed armored vehicles at rates the production plan hadn't anticipated. By the time Speer's rationalization program began genuinely accelerating German output in late 1942, the Soviet industrial system had already built a lead that Speer's considerable organizational talents could narrow, but not close. The Lend-Lease question is one I want to address honestly, because it sits at the intersection of two different kinds of distortion. The Soviet official position, maintained throughout the Cold War and present in some contemporary Russian historiography, was that Lend-Lease was marginal to Soviet victory, contributing less than 7% of total Soviet war material. This figure is technically defensible for some categories of heavy equipment, but is misleading as an overall assessment because it obscures the specific categories where American deliveries were critical. Nikita Khrushchev, in his privately recorded reminiscences published posthumously as Khrushchev Remembers, stated plainly, "Without Lend-Lease, we wouldn't have been able to cope." Zhukov, in recorded conversations published after his death, said that without American food deliveries, he didn't know how the army would have been fed. These are not the statements of men for whom Lend-Lease was marginal. On the other side, some American accounts have swung toward presenting Lend-Lease as the primary cause of Soviet survival, which overstates the case in the other direction. The consensus position of recent serious scholarship, including Mark Harrison's work on the Soviet war economy, and Sean McMeekin's more critical assessment, is that Lend-Lease was necessary, but not sufficient, essential for specific gaps the Soviet system couldn't fill, and operating alongside a Soviet industrial mobilization that was the primary driver of the material outcome. The specific Lend-Lease deliveries that mattered most were not necessarily the ones most prominently advertised. 14,834 aircraft were delivered, and these were significant. 13,303 armored vehicles were delivered. But the 375,883 trucks, primarily American Studebaker 2.5-ton vehicles, were, in a specific operational sense, the most transformative delivery of the entire program. The Soviet military's fundamental logistics failure in 1941 had been the inability to supply its armored formations with fuel and ammunition at the rate that mobile operations required. The Studebaker trucks addressed that failure directly. By 1943 and 1944, Soviet armored offensives were sustained by motorized supply columns that simply hadn't existed in the summer of 1941. The trucks were unglamorous. They didn't appear in victory parades in the way tanks did, but they were the circulatory system of every major Soviet offensive, from Kursk to Berlin. When I was cross-referencing the Lend-Lease delivery manifests with Soviet operational planning documents from 1943, I found a detail that crystallized something I'd been trying to articulate. The Lend-Lease program also delivered approximately 4.5 million tons of food: canned meat, flour, fats, sugar, which fed a substantial portion of the Red Army's caloric requirements through the middle and late war period. The Soviet agricultural system, heavily disrupted by the loss of Ukraine's productive capacity in 1941 and 42, could not feed an army of several million while simultaneously feeding the civilian population. American canned food filled the gap. Zhukov's statement about food was not rhetorical. The army that fought at Kursk, that executed Operation Bagration, that eventually reached Berlin, that army was, in part, eating food produced in American factories. This is not a comfortable fact for the narrative of purely Soviet self-sufficiency that official history preferred. It is, however, a documented one. German qualitative advantages in individual tank platforms were real and should not be minimized. German Panzer IV tanks, with their long-barreled 75mm guns, and later the Tiger I and Panther, were superior to individual T-34s in specific engagement parameters, particularly at long range and in armor protection. German tank crews trained for longer and to higher individual standards than their Soviet counterparts. German maintenance doctrine was more sophisticated. In a one-on-one engagement on open terrain, a Tiger I would, under most circumstances, defeat a T-34 at medium and long range. German after-action reports from 1942 and 43 consistently note higher Soviet than German tank losses in individual engagements. All of this was true. It simply didn't determine the outcome, because the ratio of T-34s to Tigers in the field was not 1-to-1. It was never close to 1-to-1. Quality is a variable in an equation. Quantity is also a variable. When the quantity ratio reaches 4 or 5-to-1, quality's contribution to the equation changes mathematically. The Soviet decision to accept lower manufacturing tolerances, to deliberately produce tanks that were individually less precise than the German standard, but could be produced at a much higher rate, is one of the most consequential industrial strategy decisions of the war. T-34 internal components had wider dimensional variance than equivalent German components. This made them faster and cheaper to produce, and made them more prone to mechanical failure in the first 100 kilometers of operation. The 25% early failure rate in Ural-produced tanks that I mentioned in an earlier chapter was a direct consequence of this tolerance decision. But the strategic logic was sound. A tank that breaks down after 150 kilometers, produced in 3 days, was more valuable to an army losing tanks at the rate the Red Army was losing them in 1942 than a tank of exquisite precision that took 3 weeks to produce. The mathematics of replacement outweighed the mathematics of individual reliability. This was not a desperate improvisation. It was a calculated industrial strategy that the evidence supports. It fascinates me that Speer, by most accounts a man of exceptional organizational intelligence, understood the arithmetic of the production gap clearly enough to write that marginal note, and yet remained in his post, continuing to serve the regime whose strategy the arithmetic indicted, for 2 more years. His post-war memoir, Inside the Third Reich, presents this as a kind of gradual awakening to the impossibility of the situation. I find that framing less than fully credible. The 17th of April, 1943 entry in the Spear collection shows a man who already knew, who could quantify what he knew, and who filed the knowledge in a margin rather than acting on it in any way that might have altered the strategy. The numbers were there. The reach of the numbers was limited to the margin of a page, and outside the office where that page was written, the Eastern Front was consuming German armored strength at rates that the production column in Speer's comparative summary told him couldn't be sustained. The arithmetic of 1943 tells the same story from every angle. Soviet tank production, 24,000 units. German tank production, 10,700 units. Soviet artillery production, approximately 130,000 pieces. German artillery production, 27,000 pieces. Soviet aircraft production, 34,900 units. German aircraft production, 25,200 units, improved from 1942 under Speer's rationalization, but still below Soviet output. By the time the summer of 1943 arrived, and the German army launched what would prove to be its last major offensive on the Eastern Front, it was doing so in a war where the production balance had been negative for 18 months. The tanks that would attack the Kursk salient in July of 1943 were well-designed, well-armed, and extraordinarily outnumbered by the industry that had been running in shifts in the snow in Chelyabinsk and Nizhny Tagil and Sverdlovsk since the autumn of 1941. Chapter 10. The Intelligence War. Spies, Ciphers, and the Knowledge Advantage. The 12th of April, 1943. In a file released from the SVR archive in Moscow in 2004, as part of a partial intelligence declassification, there is a single-page document stamped at the highest Soviet secrecy classification. It synthesizes 17 separate intelligence source reports into one paragraph. The paragraph predicts that German offensive operations against the Kursk salient will commence in the period between the 3rd and 8th of July, 1943. The actual start date of Operation Citadel was the 5th of July. The Soviet intelligence assessment was accurate to within 2 days on the timing of the largest armored offensive in the history of warfare. The document's final line, in translation, describes the German main effort in terms of its axis, its approximate force composition, and its operational objective. The Red Army had this information 2.5 months before the German tanks moved. What I find most interesting about the document, more interesting even than its accuracy, is that 17 separate source reports had to be synthesized to produce it. The Soviets weren't relying on a single intelligence channel. They were receiving confirmation from multiple independent directions simultaneously, and the picture they assembled from those directions was nearly exact. The question of exactly how the Soviet intelligence services knew what they knew about Operation Citadel is one of the genuinely unresolved mysteries of the Eastern Front, and I want to be honest about the limits of what the archive has established. 3 separate source streams have been identified in the historical literature. The first is Soviet military intelligence's own agent networks operating in German-occupied territory and neutral countries. The second is the Lend-Lease network, a group of sources operating from Switzerland, run by a Hungarian-born intelligence officer named Sandor Rado, which provided detailed German operational planning information throughout 1942 and 43. The identity of Lend-Lease's actual primary source has never been definitively established, though most historians who have studied the available evidence, including F.H. Hinsley in the authoritative British official history, British Intelligence in the Second World War, believe the Lend-Lease network was a conduit for British ultra-signals intelligence, maintained at arm's length to give the Soviets plausible deniability about the true source. The third stream is the British Ultra program directly. British intelligence was reading German Enigma traffic through the spring of 1943 and sharing the content, but not the source, with Soviet counterparts, with the intelligence being reformatted as agent reports before transfer. The British government has not fully declassified the files relevant to the ultra-Soviet transfer mechanism. The SVR has not fully declassified the files relevant to how the Soviet side received and processed it. Between those two institutional silences, there is an analytical gap, and the gap's existence, 80 years after the events, is itself historically significant. Someone decided that the full details of how the Soviet Union knew what it knew about Kursk should remain partially obscured, and that decision has been renewed and maintained across decades and across the political transformations of the relevant governments. I want to acknowledge that I am working with incomplete information here, and that my reading of the available evidence that British ultra-derived intelligence was a significant component of Soviet foreknowledge at Kursk is a scholarly inference, not a documented certainty. What is documented in extraordinary detail is what the Soviet command did with the intelligence it received. Between April and late June of 1943, Soviet engineering formations transformed the Kursk salient into the most formidable defensive position constructed in the history of land warfare. The statistics require careful handling because they are individually enormous and collectively almost incomprehensible, but they need to be stated. Approximately 6,000 kilometers of trenches were dug across 8 successive defensive lines, extending 300 kilometers in depth. Approximately 1,316,000 anti-tank mines were emplaced, more than one mine for every soldier committed to Operation Citadel. In the primary German approach corridors, mine density reached approximately 1,500 anti-tank mines per square kilometer. The anti-tank gun density in the main defensive sectors exceeded 1,000 guns per kilometer of front. And behind all of this, in strategic reserve, more than 1.5 million Soviet soldiers waited to be committed to the counteroffensive once the German attack had exhausted itself. The Soviet engineers' choice of wooden mines for the Kursk defensive belt is the detail that tells me most about the sophistication of the planning. The standard German mine detection equipment in use in 1943 operated on electromagnetic induction. It detected metal. A wooden anti-tank mine, containing approximately 500 grams of TNT and a simple pressure plate trigger mechanism containing minimal metal, was essentially invisible to electromagnetic detection. Soviet engineers knew this because they had studied German mine clearance doctrine. They chose the wooden PTM-41 mine specifically because they knew how the enemy would look for mines. The mine selection was counterintelligence applied to munitions planning, a discipline that operates in the gap between knowing what the enemy will do and knowing how they'll try to counter what you're doing. The gap between those two knowledges, filled correctly, produced a minefield that German engineers would cross at enormous cost. On the morning of the 5th of July, 1943, the scheduled start date of Operation Citadel, Soviet artillery opened fire at approximately 0220 hours, 20 minutes before the German attack was scheduled to begin. The barrage involved approximately 600 guns firing on German assembly areas across the northern and southern faces of the salient. It disrupted German communications, damaged assembly formations, and delayed the start of the German attack by nearly 2 hours. The barrage was only possible because Soviet artillery was already in position, already aimed, already loaded, because someone had told the artillery commanders when and where the Germans were going to attack. The commanders of the German forces receiving that preemptive barrage in the pre-dawn darkness of the 5th of July knew, in that moment, that they were attacking a position that had been waiting for them. The tactical surprise they had counted on, and which German offensive doctrine required, was gone before the first German tank moved. It fascinates me how the Soviet decision to defend at Kursk, rather than attack first, is almost always presented in the historiographical literature as obviously correct in retrospect, when contemporaneous records show it was deeply controversial at the time. Generals Vatutin and Rokossovsky both argued, in Stavka planning sessions documented in post-Soviet archival releases, for a preemptive Soviet offensive before the Germans could complete their buildup. The defensive option, absorb the German attack, let it exhaust itself on the prepared positions, then counterattack, was advocated primarily by Zhukov on the specific grounds that the defensive fortifications were comprehensive enough to make the mathematics favorable. His argument to Stalin, as reconstructed from planning documents and memoir accounts, was essentially, the defenses are strong enough that we can afford to let them come to us, and their coming to us will be more damaging to them than any preemptive attack of ours could be. It was a bet on the quality of Soviet defensive preparation. It required confidence in the intelligence that said the attack was coming, and when. It required confidence that the defensive lines would hold. It required accepting tactical passivity for strategic gain. It was the correct decision, and it was not obviously correct when it was made. When I was working through the German operational records for the pre-Citadel period, I encountered a detail that the grand strategic accounts of Kursk tend to skip past. The German Signals Intelligence Service, the Funkaufklärung, was still reporting Soviet force concentrations in the Kursk area in June of 1943, as roughly consistent with a defensive posture. They weren't wrong about the numbers. They were wrong about the meaning of the numbers. The Soviet maskirovka, the deception operations, had moved the genuine attack force into the salient, while maintaining the appearance of normal defensive disposition. False tank parks with heat signature generating dummy tanks were positioned in non-attack sectors. Radio silence was maintained in the actual attack preparation zones, while dummy traffic was broadcast on the expected frequencies. The German signals analysts were reading real signals from real locations. They were reading a performance, and they didn't know it. The Soviet intelligence apparatus in 1943 was not the same institution that had existed in June of 1941. The organization that had received 84 warnings before Barbarossa and filed them as provocations had been through 2 years of catastrophic instruction. The analysts who were synthesizing 17 source reports into a single accurate prediction on the 12th of April, 1943, had learned their trade in the hardest possible school. The specific capability, multi-source synthesis, cross-checking of independent streams, production of assessments that gave commanders decision time rather than just situational awareness, was institutional, not individual. It had been built, rebuilt, and built again across the same years that the factories were being rebuilt in Chelyabinsk, and the doctrine was being recovered from the Frunze cabinet drawer. The SVR archive document, with its 2-day accurate prediction, is the intelligence equivalent of the January 1942 production figures, evidence that the broken institution had reconstituted itself into something that functioned. The 5th of July, 1943, 02:20 hours. The Soviet guns opened fire. In the German assembly areas, in the pre-dawn dark, men who had been preparing to attack are instead taking cover. The preemptive barrage wasn't supposed to happen. The surprise was supposed to belong to the side that was attacking, not the side that was waiting. The German commanders requesting assessments from their intelligence officers were receiving answers that contradicted what the barrage was already demonstrating. The archive of the Soviet intelligence system's work in the spring of 1943 sits in a partly declassified file in Moscow. The archive of its consequences sits in the German divisional records from the 5th of July onward, in the casualty reports, in the fuel consumption figures, in the increasingly compressed handwriting of commanders trying to explain why the operation that was supposed to take 10 days was consuming more than that in its first 4 hours. The intelligence document predicted the day within 2 days. The guns opened on the predicted day. The rest is arithmetic. Chapter 11. Kursk, the last German offensive. The 5th of July, 1943. North face of the Kursk salient. At 05 hours, after the 2-hour delay caused by the Soviet preemptive barrage, the German 9th Army begins its advance into the prepared Soviet defensive zone. The temperature is approximately 22 degrees Celsius. The sky is clear. The initial German assault formations, infantry supported by armor, move forward into terrain that looks, from aerial photographs, like open steppe. It is not open steppe. In the first 500 meters, German engineers begin encountering the wooden PTM-41 anti-tank mines that Soviet engineers emplaced over the preceding months. The electromagnetic detectors sweep clean. The mines don't register. The first German tank losses of Operation Citadel are not to Soviet anti-tank guns or to Soviet armor. They are to wooden boxes in the ground, filled with high explosive, that the most sophisticated military technology available in 1943 cannot detect. By the end of the first day of Operation Citadel on the northern face, the German 9th Army had penetrated approximately 10 kilometers. The operational plan had specified a penetration of 30 to 50 kilometers on day 1. The 9th Army was 20 kilometers short of its daily objective before the sun had set on the first afternoon. In the Bundesarchiv, the 48th Panzer Corps' fuel consumption log for the 5th through the 15th of July, 1943 contains a column entry for the 9th of July that I keep returning to. The daily diesel requirement for the Corps was filed at 217,000 liters. In the column marked Delivered, a different hand, presumably a quartermaster, has filled in 83,000 liters, roughly 38% of requirement. In the margin, in red ink, Straße gesperrt, road blocked. A Soviet air attack on the supply column the previous night had closed the primary supply route. The most sophisticated armored force in Europe, at the moment of its most critical offensive operation, was receiving less than 2/5 of its required fuel because of an airstrike on a supply road. When I look at this document, I am struck by how thoroughly it refutes the post-war German memoir literature's insistence that Kursk failed because Hitler terminated the offensive prematurely to respond to the Allied landings in Sicily. The offensive was physically running out of fuel 9 days before Hitler terminated it. General Hermann Balck, who commanded the 11th Panzer Division within the 48th Panzer Corps during Operation Citadel, is the German commander whose post-war account, published in English translation as Order in Chaos in 2015, I find most valuable for understanding the German experience of Kursk from the inside. Balck was one of the most technically capable German armored commanders of the war, and his memoir has an unusual quality of professional honesty about operational failure. He doesn't blame Hitler for Kursk, which sets him apart from the standard German officer memoir tradition. He describes the progressive erosion of the attack's momentum against successive Soviet defensive lines with the precision of a man who was watching his operational instrument wear down day by day. He notes the cumulative effect of the mine losses, not just the tanks destroyed, but the time consumed in clearing lanes, the disruption to formation cohesion, the psychological weight on crews who couldn't see what was killing their vehicles. The German tank losses at Kursk were not all dramatic long-range gun duels. A significant proportion were boxes in the ground. The Tiger I tank, committed to Kursk in the largest numbers it had yet been deployed, was the weapon around which German operational hopes at Kursk were substantially organized, and its performance deserves honest examination. The Tiger I weighed 57 tons, was armed with an 88mm main gun, capable of penetrating any Soviet tank at combat ranges, and was armored to a standard that most Soviet anti-tank weapons couldn't penetrate from the front. In individual engagements, it was formidable. Its operational availability rate at Kursk was substantially lower than the propaganda surrounding it suggested. The Maybach Olvar pre-selector gearbox, an 8-speed transmission of considerable mechanical complexity, was prone to failure under sustained combat stress, particularly in the heat of a July Russian summer, where engine temperatures frequently reached the upper limit of tolerance. In the Kursk operation, approximately 17% of Tiger tanks were out of action on any given day due to transmission and mechanical failures, before accounting for combat damage. The recovery and repair of disabled Tigers consumed engineering resources that were simultaneously needed elsewhere. The best German tank of the war was, in field conditions, an operationally unreliable platform that required approximately 3.8 times the maintenance hours of a T-34 for equivalent operating time. The Panther tank, introduced at Kursk in approximately 200 units as a counter to the T-34, suffered a mechanical catastrophe in the operation's opening days that the German command had insufficient time to absorb. On the 5th of July, of the Panthers committed to the attack on the southern face, approximately 160 suffered engine fires or transmission failures within the first 48 hours, before making meaningful contact with Soviet forces. The Panther's Maybach HL-230 engine, in its initial production configuration, had an oil system with inadequate sealing under vibration, causing oil to contact hot engine components. The fires that resulted were not combat damage. They were engineering failures, driven by the rushed introduction of a new design into mass production, under Hitler's personal directive to have Panthers ready for Kursk specifically. The vehicle was potentially excellent. Its rushed deployment made it a maintenance burden that consumed German engineering capacity during the critical opening days of the offensive. The tank battle of Prokhorovka on the 12th of July, 1943, is the Kursk engagement that has attracted the most historical attention and generated the most significant post-Soviet revision. Soviet official historiography presented it as a massive head-on clash, involving approximately 1,200 tanks, resulting in a decisive Soviet tactical victory. The archival research of Valery Zamulin, published in English translation as Demolishing the Myth in 2011, has substantially revised this account. The actual engagement involved approximately 400 German tanks of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps and between 600 and 800 Soviet tanks of the 5th Guards Tank Army. Soviet tank losses significantly exceeded German losses. The operational records indicate a ratio of approximately 3 to 4 Soviet losses for every 1 German loss. Prokhorovka was tactically a Soviet defeat, and the Soviet Fifth Guards Tank Army's operational report, filed at Samo on the 13th of July 1943, records heavy losses and requests immediate armored reinforcement. That document was classified until 1993. The myth served a purpose. The myth was not the history. What made Prokhorovka strategically sufficient, despite being tactically negative, was the cumulative context in which it occurred. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps had been fighting for 7 days. Its fuel situation was constrained by the supply road that had been blocked. Its supporting infantry had not advanced at the rate required to protect the armored formation's flanks. The 8 successive Soviet defensive lines, each one requiring a new attack, each one consuming German armored strength, had reduced the attacking force to the point where a tactical defeat at Prokhorovka, rather than precipitating a German breakthrough, simply registered as another day's attrition in a week of attrition. Zhukov's calculation before the battle had been precise. The defenses were strong enough that the Germans would exhaust themselves against them before reaching the reserves. His calculation was correct. The mechanism of its being correct was not a glorious Soviet tactical triumph at Prokhorovka. It was a grinding, expensive, unheralded process of absorbing German offensive power across 8 defensive lines over 9 days. On the 13th of July, Hitler terminated Operation Citadel. His stated rationale, as recorded in the OKH operational directive at the Bundesarchive, was the Allied landings in Sicily on the 10th of July and the requirement to transfer forces to Italy. This was partially accurate as a description of the strategic context. It was not accurate as a description of the operational reality, which was that the German attack had already consumed its available armored strength and could not be continued, regardless of what was happening in Sicily. The termination of Citadel was the correct operational decision. The reasoning offered for it was a convenient narrative that preserved the fiction that the German army had chosen to stop rather than been stopped. German commanders' private accounts, including Balk's memoir and the war diaries of the formations involved, are more candid. The fuel log for the 9th of July is more candid still. The total German armored losses during Operation Citadel, across both the northern and southern faces, amounted to approximately 1,120 armored vehicles in 8 days of offensive operations. The German force had begun the operation with approximately 2,450 tanks and assault guns. It had consumed nearly half of them in 8 days against a defensive position that had been prepared for their arrival. After Citadel, the German army on the Eastern Front was never again in a position to launch a major strategic offensive. It would fight for 23 more months, and it would fight with considerable tactical skill in many defensive engagements. It would never again attack at the scale and with the operational ambition that Citadel represented. The war had one direction after the 13th of July, 1943. When I read through the fuel consumption log for the 48th Panzer Corps, day by day across those 8 days, watching the requested quantities and the delivered quantities diverge, watching the red ink marginal notations multiply, watching the shortfall between what the operation required and what the logistics system could provide, I find myself thinking about the fuel requisition form from the 26th of June, 1941. The Soviet form with its 4-letter question, where? The fuel that wasn't there. 2 years later, on the other side of the front, the same question in a different language. Strasse gesperrt. Road blocked. The armies had exchanged their logistics problems. The Soviet army had learned, at incalculable cost, to solve its version of the problem. The German army, at Kursk, ran out of time to solve its. Chapter 12. The Generals. Zhukov, Rokossovsky, Vasilevsky, and the Command Renaissance. Sometime in October of 1943, a Stavka conference was held in Moscow. The stenographic record, one of the few such records to have been partially declassified from the presidential archive, contains a specific exchange that has stayed with me since I first encountered it in a post-Soviet historical publication. The record notes that Marshal Zhukov and General Rokossovsky disagreed on the proposed axis of advance for an upcoming operation. Stalin asked each commander to state his position. 8 lines of the subsequent discussion have been redacted in the declassified copy, covered in black ink that the document's editors clearly decided should remain opaque. After the redaction, the record continues. The Voronezh axis was approved. Rokossovsky's proposal was accepted. Zhukov, the most prominent military figure of the Soviet war, the man whose face is most closely associated with Soviet victory, lost the argument. The stenographer recorded it, the archive preserved it, and the 8 redacted lines, whatever they contained, sit there as a reminder that the story of Soviet military command was not the story of a single dominant genius, which is how Soviet official history preferred to present it. Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov is simultaneously the most indispensable figure in Soviet military history, and the most complicated one to assess honestly. His operational achievements span the entire war: the defense of Moscow in December of 1941, the coordination of Operation Uranus at Stalingrad in November of 1942, the defensive planning at Kursk in 1943, the direction of the Bagration coordination, and the eventual assault on Berlin in April of 1945. The scale of what he accomplished across 4 years, under conditions of pressure that would have broken most military commanders, is extraordinary by any standard. His memoir, Reminiscences and Reflections, published in 1969, is a fascinating document precisely because of its omissions. Operation Mars, the simultaneous November 1942 offensive against Army Group Center's Rzhev salient that failed catastrophically while Uranus succeeded, does not appear in the memoir with any candor. Zhukov's role in planning and commanding a disaster that cost 335,000 casualties is recorded in the operational archives at TSAMO. The memoir covers it in a few sentences. Both documents are primary sources. Only one of them is honest. Konstantin Konstantinovich Rokossovsky is the commander whose story most resists the official narrative, and not only because his operational achievements deserve more recognition than Soviet historiography allowed him. Rokossovsky was arrested in 1937 during the Purge. He was interrogated by the NKVD, and post-Soviet archival releases confirm that he was subjected to physical coercion. Among the documented consequences were broken teeth and damage consistent with sustained physical abuse. He confessed to espionage under these conditions. He subsequently recanted. He was held for approximately 3 years, released in 1940, and returned to military command. He was one of a very small number of officers to survive the full process: arrest, confession, recantation, release, and resume a military career. David Glantz and Robert Citino, two of the most rigorous Western military historians of the Eastern Front, regard Rokossovsky's operational handling of the Don Front at Stalingrad and the Central Front at Kursk as technically among the most sophisticated Soviet operations of the war. He disagreed openly with both Zhukov and Stalin at multiple planning sessions, and on several recorded occasions, as the stenographic record confirms, he prevailed. There is a specific detail in the Rokossovsky archival record that I want to name directly, because I think it carries more moral weight than most of what gets called courage in military history. During his NKVD interrogation, according to the declassified records examined by post-Soviet historians, Rokossovsky was offered, as the standard NKVD procedure provided, the opportunity to implicate colleagues as co-conspirators in exchange for reduced personal consequences. He declined, under conditions of continuing physical coercion, to name names. 4 of the officers he was asked to implicate, and didn't, went on to serve as corps commanders during the war. Their survival and their service, the specific operational outcomes that their continued existence made possible, trace back, in a direct line, to a decision made in a Lubyanka basement by a man who had had his teeth knocked out and was being asked to sign a document. The archive holds the decision. History holds the consequences. Alexander Mikhailovich Vasilevsky is the general who, I would argue, is most consistently undervalued in the popular understanding of how the Soviet Union won the Eastern Front. And this undervaluation was not accidental. Vasilevsky served as chief of the General Staff from June of 1942 onward, and in that role, he was the primary operational planner of the 3 most consequential Soviet offensive operations of the war: Operation Uranus at Stalingrad, Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944, and the Manchurian Campaign of August 1945. He was present at the planning sessions. He drafted the operational documents. He coordinated the logistics. And Soviet official history, in the decades following the war, consistently emphasized Zhukov's role in these operations, while Vasilevsky's contribution was treated as staff-level support. The post-Soviet archival releases have partially corrected this. Vasilevsky's own memoir, A Lifelong Cause, published in 1973, is more candid about his planning role than Zhukov's parallel account. And where the two memoirs describe the same events differently, the operational planning documents at TSAMO more often support Vasilevsky's version. The specific question of who designed Operation Uranus is a case study in the historiographical complexity of the Soviet command system. Zhukov, in his memoir, presents the plan as substantially his own conception, developed in his September of 1942 meeting with Stalin. Vasilevsky's memoir presents himself as co-equal architect, with his continuous planning work over the preceding 2 months as the operational foundation that Zhukov's input shaped. The planning documents, partially declassified from TSAMO, show Vasilevsky in continuous working sessions on the Uranus plan for approximately 8 weeks before Zhukov's documented involvement intensified. The question is not whether Zhukov contributed. He clearly did, and his contribution was significant. The question is whether the historical record accurately reflects the relative weight of contribution. Based on the available evidence, I don't think it does. The Stavka system under Stalin, from late 1942 onward, had a specific operational dynamic that doesn't map cleanly onto either the image of Stalin as omniscient genius, Soviet official version, or as constant obstruction, the post-war German memoir version of Soviet command. Stalin's operational judgment improved demonstrably between 1941 and 1944. His ability to evaluate competing operational proposals on technical merits, to ask the right logistical questions, to probe the assumptions underlying a plan, developed across the war years in ways that the stenographic records and memoir accounts both confirm. Whether this improvement was genuine learning or the effect of having better generals producing better plans that he was simply more willing to approve is a question the archive doesn't clearly resolve. It may be both. The relationship between Stalin and his generals by 1943 and 44 had reached a functional equilibrium that it demonstrably had not possessed in the catastrophic summer of 1941. By January of 1944, the Red Army's General Officer Corps had an average of approximately 2.3 years of combat command experience at their current rank. In January of 1941, the equivalent figure had been approximately 0.1 years. The difference between those two numbers, 2.2 years of accumulated operational experience, was the most valuable military resource the Soviet Union possessed by the middle of the war, and it had been purchased at a cost that no reasonable accounting can make clean. Every month of that experience represents battles fought, formations destroyed, mistakes made and partly learned from, commanders killed and replaced by commanders who had watched them die. The institutional knowledge accumulated in those 2.2 years was the product of approximately 8 million Soviet military dead in the period June of 1941 to January of 1944. The most expensive education in the history of warfare produced, eventually, the generals who could use it. The standardized Soviet operational planning format, the Operativny Plan, adopted by the General Staff in mid-1942, is a document that rarely gets the analytical attention it deserves. It required commanders to specify not just operational objectives and axes of advance, but explicit logistical foundations, fuel days, ammunition loads by type, replacement personnel requirements, bridge crossing specifications, air support sortie requirements by mission type, and rear area security provisions. Every plan submitted to Stavka for approval had to answer these questions before the operational objectives were considered. The format was a direct institutional response to the logistics collapses of 1941 and the command failures of 1942. The generals who filled out these forms in 1943 and 1944 were doing so with the memory of what happened when those questions weren't answered. The form was administrative. Its intellectual content was a record of everything that had gone wrong in the previous 2 years. The Stavka Conference in October of 1943 ends, in the stenographic record, with a decision. The Voronezh Axis, Rokossovsky's proposal. The 8 redacted lines remain opaque. Whatever argument Zhukov made in those 8 lines wasn't sufficient. The man who had survived the Lubyanka, who had come back from it with his teeth repaired and his operational instincts intact, had presented a better case. The stenographer recorded the outcome with the neutral precision of their profession. Approved. Accepted. The conference moved to the next item. Outside the building, in Moscow in October, the temperature was falling. The war had perhaps 18 months left to run. The generals who would fight those 18 months were in the room, arguing with each other about the correct axis of advance, being recorded and partially redacted by the system that had simultaneously tried to destroy them and depended on their existence. The archive holds the record. The 8 lines remain dark. Chapter 13, Operation Bagration, the destruction of an army group. The 22nd of June, 1944, the 3rd anniversary of Operation Barbarossa, Army Group Center, holding a vast salient stretching from the Baltic approaches to the Pripyat marshes, was considered by German military intelligence to be in a defensible position. The most recent Fremde Heere Ost assessment had placed the expected Soviet summer offensive against Army Group North Ukraine, to the south, not against center. 2 panzer corps had been quietly moved to reinforce the anticipated attack sector. Army Group Center's commander, Field Marshal Ernst Busch, had implemented Hitler's Fortified Places Directive, designating key cities including Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk as fortresses to be held to the last, regardless of encirclement. The intelligence assessment was wrong. The Fortress Directive was about to produce consequences of a specific and terrible kind. And on the evening of the 22nd of June, in Soviet formations across a front of approximately 500 kilometers east of the German positions, soldiers who had been under strict radio silence for weeks were still under strict radio silence, communicating only by landline and courier, while the headquarters whose radio signatures the German Signals Intelligence Service was monitoring were in entirely different locations, broadcasting normal traffic patterns to sets of receivers positioned where the Funkaufklärung analysts expected them to be. The Soviet operational deception, Maskirovka, conducted in preparation for Operation Bagration, was, by any measure, one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations of the Second World War. The specific technique employed against German signals intelligence involved a procedure the Soviets called desinformatia radiosviacji, radio deception. Soviet signals units moved genuine Army headquarters radio equipment to secondary positions distant from the actual headquarters locations, and continued broadcasting normal traffic patterns, the characteristic signatures of particular headquarters that German signals analysts had learned to identify from those secondary positions. The actual headquarters maintained complete radio silence and communicated only by landline and courier. The result was that German signals intelligence was reading real transmissions from real equipment, reporting genuine Soviet headquarters as stationary and in their expected positions, while the actual formations were assembling in the attack zones in silence. The German intelligence picture of Soviet deployments immediately before Bagration was not a picture of a hidden Soviet attack. It was a performance, broadcast specifically for the German analysts, and the German analysts received it as data. The false impressions created by the radio deception were reinforced by a comprehensive program of physical deception in the non-attack sectors. In the area opposite Army Group North Ukraine, where German intelligence expected the Soviet main effort, dummy tank parks were constructed that included heat-generating elements designed to produce thermal signatures visible to German aerial reconnaissance. Dummy supply depots were built with visible activity patterns. Genuine armored formations were moved visibly toward the Lvov area during daylight hours, under conditions likely to be observed, and then quietly withdrawn at night. The German intelligence assessment of mid-May 1944 placed the Soviet main effort directly opposite these false targets. When Operation Bagration opened on the 23rd of June, the 2 panzer corps that might have contested the Soviet breakthrough of Army Group Center were positioned several hundred kilometers to the south, waiting for an attack that never came. On the 23rd of June, 1944, at 05 hours, the Soviet preparatory bombardment opened along the breakthrough sectors. The artillery density in the main attack corridors had been built to approximately 180 guns per kilometer of front, a concentration that produced a physical and acoustic experience without parallel in the history of land warfare. German defensive positions that had been prepared over 2 years of static front were struck simultaneously along a 500-kilometer frontage. Within the first 24 hours, Soviet forces had penetrated the German front in multiple sectors to depths of up to 25 kilometers. Within 48 hours, the German 53rd Corps at Vitebsk was encircled. Within 72 hours, the German 9th Army south of Boguchevsk was beginning to lose coherent contact with its corps-level formations. The German 9th Army radio log for the 23rd through the 27th of June, which I described at the opening of this chapter, dies word by word across those 5 days. the entries shortening as the command structure disintegrates, the final entry reporting enemy forces in the rear, and no contact with army group. After that, silence. The Fortified Places Directive, Hitler's order that designated Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk as fortresses to be held regardless of encirclement, produced the specific catastrophe that its internal military logic required. The garrisons designated to hold these cities were ordered to remain in position as Soviet armored formations swept past them, cutting them off from any possibility of relief or breakout. The defenders of the fortified places fought with considerable determination, and in some cases held their positions for days after complete encirclement. What they could not do was affect the operation's outcome. The Soviet operational plan had been designed specifically around the fortified places, the deliberate bypass of these positions, leaving them encircled behind the advancing front, was built into the planning from the beginning. The directive that was supposed to create breakwaters in the Soviet advance had instead created isolated pockets that consumed their garrisons without contributing to the defense of the collapsing front. By the 3rd of July 1944, Soviet forces had recaptured Minsk and closed the largest encirclement of the Bagration operation, trapping approximately 100,000 German troops east of the city. Within 9 weeks of the operation's opening, 28 of Army Group Center's 34 divisions had been destroyed as coherent fighting formations. The overall German casualty figure for the operation, across all phases, is estimated at approximately 450,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, exceeding German losses at Stalingrad and representing the largest defeat in German military history. Army Group Center had lost 88% of its tanks, 33% of its heavy artillery, and effectively ceased to exist as a strategic force. The Soviet Union had advanced approximately 700 kilometers in 9 weeks, a rate of advance exceeding any comparable operation on the Western Front, which opened on the 6th of June, 1944. The Normandy landings and the Bagration offensive were simultaneous. In Western popular memory, Normandy is the war's decisive moment. By the arithmetic of German casualties, the summer of 1944's decisive event happened further east. When I was examining the German operational records for the period immediately following Bagration's opening, specifically Field Marshal Walter Model's situation reports after he was sent by Hitler to stabilize the front, I found something that illuminates the scope of the deception's success. Model, arguably the Wehrmacht's most capable defensive specialist, spent his first 4 days after assuming command issuing orders based on intelligence that the Soviet Maskirovka had made obsolete. He was attempting to construct defensive lines based on German unit positions that no longer existed and Soviet force concentrations that the signals intelligence was still misplacing. By the time accurate situational awareness had been established, by the time Model was working from correct information, rather than the performance the Soviet signals units had been broadcasting, the front had moved 200 kilometers westward. The Maskirovka hadn't just created initial surprise, it had extended the period of German command disorientation through the critical days when a rapid German response might have partially stabilized the situation. On the 17th of July, 1944, Stalin ordered 57,000 German prisoners captured during Bagration to be marched through Moscow in a public procession. The NKVD records for the event and Pravda's coverage from the 18th of July describe the organization of this with careful detail. The prisoners were marched in columns through central Moscow streets, observed by thousands of Muscovites. Soviet street cleaning trucks followed the columns, washing the pavement behind the marching prisoners, a specific, staged humiliation, deliberate in its choreography. 3 years earlier, German forces had stood on the outskirts of this city. German reconnaissance aircraft had photographed the Kremlin's spires. The city had partially evacuated its government ministries in October of 1941, when the situation seemed potentially unrecoverable. Now, German prisoners were walking through its central streets in July heat, preceded and followed by crowds who had been living in this city through the entire war. The procession lasted several hours. The street cleaning trucks followed at a careful distance. Operation Bagration was, in the most direct technical sense, the complete operational realization of what Tukhachevsky had theorized in his 1936 field manual, the manual that had been stamped, withdrawn from circulation, in the autumn of 1937. Simultaneous attack across the enemy's entire operational depth, front and rear struck concurrently, reserves prevented from functioning, the defensive system induced into catastrophic failure rather than pushed back through attrition. The doctrine had been buried. It had been partially preserved in a filing cabinet. It had been recovered, rebuilt, tested at enormous cost in the catastrophes of 1941 and 42, refined at Stalingrad and Kursk, and brought to its full expression in the summer of 1944, against an army group that the German High Command had assessed as secure. The radio sets broadcasting their false signatures went quiet after the operation was complete. The real headquarters, which had maintained their silence through the planning phase, resumed normal communications. The performance was over. What remained was a front that had moved 700 kilometers in 9 weeks, and a gap in the German order of battle where Army Group Center had been. Chapter 14. The Human Catastrophe. 27 million deaths, and what they mean in the Russian State Archive of the Economy. In a file catalogued as RGAE 1662, there is a bound document 247 pages long, completed in 1959, and stamped with the highest Soviet secrecy classification. Its title translates as Statistical Report on Population Losses, USSR, 1941 to 1945. On the first page, in red ink, a handwritten note reads, Niet dla opublikowania, not for publication. The document was not declassified until 1990. The final page gives a total figure. Someone has circled it in pencil. Below the circle, in handwriting that appears to have been added later, possibly by a different hand, Proverenaya cifra, verified figure. The number circled, in a document that was not for publication for 31 years, is 26.6 million, not the 20 million that Soviet official history maintained throughout the Cold War. 26.6 million. Someone had verified it, written it down, circled it, and then locked it in an archive. The gap between the official number and the verified number, approximately 6.6 million people, is itself larger than the total military dead of either the United States or Great Britain in the entire war. I want to spend some time with the structure of this number before moving to its human meaning, because the structure itself carries information. Of the 26 to 27 million Soviet dead, approximately 8.7 million were military personnel killed in action or dying of wounds. Approximately 3 million were military personnel who died in German captivity, out of approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers taken prisoner during the war. Approximately 7.5 million were civilians deliberately killed by German occupation forces or their collaborators, a figure that includes approximately 1.5 million Soviet Jews murdered in the systematic killing operations of the Einsatzgruppen and their local auxiliaries. Approximately 4 million died in German-occupied territory from deliberate starvation and disease policies. The remainder, approximately 2 to 3 million, died in circumstances that include the Gulag, the evacuation, and deaths attributable to Soviet rather than German policy. That last category is the most contested in the historiographical literature, and I want to be direct about the contestation. Russian official historiography resists including Soviet-caused deaths in the 27 million figure, while historians like Timothy Snyder in Bloodlands argue that the violence of both totalitarian systems in the borderland territories should be understood as a single interconnected phenomenon. I am not going to resolve this debate. I am going to tell you that it exists and that it matters. The city of Leningrad endured a siege of 872 days. From the 8th of September 1941, when German forces closed the land approaches, to the 27th of January 1944, when the siege was finally and fully broken, Leningrad existed in a condition for which the modern vocabulary of urban privation is insufficient. In December of 1941, the daily bread ration for most civilians had fallen to 125 grams, approximately one thin slice of adulterated bread, containing approximately 300 calories, representing approximately 15% of the caloric requirement for a sedentary adult. The people receiving this ration were not sedentary. They were working in factories, maintaining city infrastructure, conducting civil defense duties in temperatures that, in December of 1941, fell below -25 degrees Celsius in many sectors. The daily mortality from starvation during the worst months, November of 1941 through February of 1942, has been estimated by post-Soviet demographic research at between 3,000 and 4,000 people per day. Approximately 800,000 to 1 million civilians died during the siege's duration. Lena Mukina's diary, published in English translation in 2011, records from inside this experience with a clarity that the aggregate numbers cannot replicate. The official histories describe the siege as heroic endurance. Mukina's diary describes watching her own face change and being frightened by what she saw in the mirror. The Soviet prisoner of war mortality rate in German captivity, approximately 57% of all captured Soviet personnel died, is the single figure that most directly reflects the intersection of the war's military and ideological dimensions. Western Allied prisoners in German captivity died at approximately 4%, a figure that includes the particular brutalities of the final months of the war. The gap between 4% and 57% is not a military statistic. It is the direct operational consequence of a specific policy decision. The Wehrmacht and SS deliberately withheld Geneva Convention protections from Soviet prisoners on the explicit ideological grounds that the Soviet Union had not signed the convention and that Slavic prisoners were racially categorized as subhuman by Nazi doctrine. The starvation of Soviet prisoner of war camps in the winter of 1941 to 1942, where recorded mortality rates reached approximately 2% per day in some facilities, was not a consequence of German logistical overextension alone, though overextension was a contributing factor. It was the consequence of a command decision about whose lives had value and whose did not. Approximately 3 million people died as a direct consequence of that decision. The Extraordinary State Commission, the Чрезвычайная Государственная комиссия, known by its acronym CHGK, was established in 1942 to document German war crimes and material destruction in occupied Soviet territory. It sent investigation teams to every liberated district, interviewed survivors, cataloged physical destruction, and compiled mortality statistics by locality. Its final report runs to approximately 27 volumes and was used as primary evidentiary documentation at the Nuremberg Tribunal. It is simultaneously one of the most valuable primary source collections in the history of the war, and a document shaped by specific political decisions about what to count, what to attribute, and what to omit. Post-Soviet researchers examining the CHGK's methodology have found that its figures for Ukrainian and Belarusian losses were systematically undercounted, not through clerical error, but through deliberate choices about which categories of death fell within the Commission's investigative mandate. The undercounting was not random, it had a pattern. The pattern, examined carefully, reflects the political interests of the state that commissioned the count. When I was working through the post-war materials, specifically the NKVD records governing the treatment of returning Soviet prisoners of war and of civilians who had lived and worked under German occupation, I found a specific administrative category that speaks to the war's moral interior in ways that no battle account does. The category is filtration, the systematic screening of liberated populations and returning military personnel for potential collaboration with German forces. The filtration process was administered by the NKVD and involved the review of each individual's wartime activities, their location during occupation, any contact with German administrative structures, and their post-liberation political reliability. For returning prisoners of war, men who had survived years of German captivity at a 57% mortality rate, filtration frequently resulted in a further period of detention, investigation, and in many cases re-imprisonment in Soviet facilities. The men who had survived the Germans were, upon their return, processed by the system they had been fighting for. Some were imprisoned, some were assigned to punishment battalions and sent back to the front. A proportion were eventually cleared and released. The specific percentages vary by period and circumstance and are documented in post-Soviet archival research by Viktor Zemskov. The process itself, its existence, its systematic character, is not in dispute. The Soviet state's management of collective memory after the war's end is a subject that deserves its own careful attention, because it is not simply a story of censorship and suppression, though it is partly that. Svetlana Alexievich, whose oral history of Soviet women's wartime experience, The Unwomanly Face of War, was published in 1985 and formally criticized by Soviet cultural authorities, collected testimony from hundreds of female veterans who described being actively discouraged from discussing their wartime service. not forbidden in most cases, discouraged. By returning male veterans, by their own families, by the cultural atmosphere of the post-war years. The encouragement was to re-enter domestic life, to be wives and mothers rather than soldiers, to allow the war to become something that had happened to the men, and to which the women had been peripheral. The 800,000 women who had served in the Soviet armed forces, including combat soldiers, pilots, anti-aircraft crews, partisans, were being asked to perform a collective forgetting. Many refused. The testimony Alexievich collected represents that refusal, preserved across decades by women who understood that they were the only archive of their own experience. It takes approximately 9 seconds to say the number 27 million, to hold it as a quantity, as a genuine reckoning with 27 million individual human deaths, each one with a name, a family, a face that was remembered by someone, is something else entirely, and I am not sure it is possible in any direct cognitive sense. What I have found, reading through years of material on this war, is that the people who survived it rarely use the large numbers. Memoir accounts, diary entries, letters home. They are almost entirely particular. They are about one person, one village, one tree, one day. The aggregation into historical statistics happened afterward, at distance, and serves functions that the people inside the experience didn't need. The 27 million is true and necessary and insufficient simultaneously. The pencil circle around it in the 1959 document is there because someone needed to verify it was the right number. Someone needed to confirm what had been counted. The confirmation note, verified figure, is in the archive. The people counted are not. The material destruction that accompanied the human losses was assessed by the CHGK at approximately 2.57 trillion rubles at 1941 prices, approximately 1.7 times the Soviet Union's entire pre-war annual national income. 1,710 towns and approximately 70,000 villages had been destroyed or severely damaged. 31,850 industrial enterprises had been wrecked. 65,000 kilometers of railway track had been demolished. The country that won the war had been materially destroyed in the course of winning it. The reconstruction that followed was real. Soviet industrial output by 1948 had largely recovered to pre-war levels in most categories, and it was achieved at the cost of civilian living standards that remained at wartime or below wartime levels through the late 1940s and into the 50s. The people who had survived the war survived its aftermath in conditions that the victory's official narrative made difficult to discuss honestly. The margin note on the first page of the 1959 document, not for publication, is dated internally by the document's content as having been added sometime after the final figures were compiled. Someone read the verified figure, circled it, noted its verification, and then wrote that it should not be published. The decision to suppress the accurate figure, to maintain the 20 million number rather than the 26.6 million, was made at some level of the Soviet state apparatus with sufficient authority to have it stamped and filed. The motivation is not recorded in the document. It doesn't need to be. The 20 million figure had been cited in official commemorations, in international comparisons, in arguments about the Soviet Union's disproportionate sacrifice. The verified figure was 6.6 million larger. 6.6 million is the population of a substantial European country. The gap between the official memory and the verified reality is not a rounding error. It is a political act, legible in pencil, in a bound document, in an archive that didn't open for 31 more years. Chapter 15, The Women's War, 800,000 Invisible Soldiers. In the collections of the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense at TSAMO in Podolsk, there is a personnel file from the 25th Rifle Division. The file contains a standard printed service record form with handwritten entries. Under Combat Function, someone has typed a single word, Sniper, Sniper. Under Commendations, there are 5 separate entries. The last, dated the 25th of October, 1943, reads, Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest decoration the Soviet state could award. Below the service record form, filed on paper of a different stock, is a second document, a post-war employment assessment dated 1946. The category marked Recommended Role has been filled in by a different hand, Instructor, non-combat. The personnel file belongs to Ludmila Mikhailovna Pavlichenko. She had, by June of 1942, recorded 309 confirmed kills, the highest verified figure of any sniper, male or female, from any nation in the Second World War. The most lethal sniper of the war had been recommended, at the war's end, for a non-combat instructor role. The form is in the archive. The institutional logic it embodies is not difficult to read. Approximately 800,000 women served in the Soviet armed forces during the Second World War. They served as snipers, anti-aircraft gunners, tank crew, combat pilots, partisan fighters, radio operators, surgeons, nurses, and in dozens of other roles across every branch of the service. This figure, 800,000, comes from Soviet Defense Ministry records and has been consistent across post-Soviet archival research. It is a number without any equivalent in the military history of any other belligerent power in any modern war. The British and American forces included women in auxiliary and support roles. Neither deployed women in direct combat roles at any significant scale. The German armed forces employed women in auxiliary roles, but not in combat. The Soviet Union, facing a manpower demand that the male population alone could not meet after the catastrophic losses of 1941 and 42, conscripted and accepted women into roles that the stated policies of every other major military power of the period categorically excluded. The 800,000 served. The official post-war history of the Soviet armed forces allocated them a footnote. The 3 all-female aviation regiments formed in the autumn of 1941 are the most documented component of women's Soviet military service, and the most striking. The 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment flew Yak-1 interceptors and air defense roles over the Soviet interior. The 587th Bomber Aviation Regiment flew Sukhoi Su-2 light bombers, and later Petlyakov PE-2 dive bombers on tactical missions. But it is the 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, later redesignated the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, that most defies the narrative categories usually available for wartime aviation. The regiment flew Polikarpov PO-2 biplanes, aircraft designed in 1927 as crop dusters and trainers, with a maximum speed of approximately 150 kilometers per hour and a maximum bomb load of 300 kilograms. They navigated by landmarks and starlight. They flew between 8 and 18 sorties per night per aircraft at peak operational tempo, 3 to 6 times the sortie rate expected of male bomber crews. Over the course of the war, the regiment flew more than 23,000 sorties and dropped approximately 3,000 tons of bombs. German forces opposing them offered the Iron Cross specifically for shooting one down, recognizing both the psychological and operational impact of what the Germans called Nachthexen, night witches. The PO-2's maximum speed was slower than the stall speed of most German fighters. This meant that German night fighter pilots attempting to intercept the regiment's aircraft faced a specific tactical problem. Their aircraft could not slow sufficiently to match the PO-2's speed in a standard pursuit engagement without stalling and losing control. German pilots developed specific interception tactics to address this, attacking from below and behind, reducing throttle to minimum. But the aircraft's speed paradox, combined with the low altitude at which the regiment flew and the pilots' tactic of idling their engines on the bomb run to reduce acoustic and visual signature, made interception consistently difficult. The engine idling tactic was not in any tactical doctrine manual. It was devised by the regiment's own pilots, who calculated that their aircraft's low speed made them vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire on standard approach angles, and that the sound of a gliding biplane was harder for listening posts to track than a powered approach. The tactic was operational innovation, produced entirely within the regiment, by women who had been handed inadequate aircraft, and had engineered the inadequacy into an advantage. Lyudmila Pavlichenko arrived in the United States in August of 1942 as part of a Soviet government delegation intended to build American public support for the Allied cause, and, specifically, for the opening of a second front in Western Europe. She was 25 years old. She was the first Soviet citizen to be received by an American president. Franklin Roosevelt welcomed her at the White House on the 27th of August. She then embarked on a speaking tour that took her to Chicago, New York, and several other cities. American newspaper coverage of her visit focused, with a consistency that her own accounts describe as bewildering, on her physical appearance, her hair, her uniform's cut, and a question that was apparently asked at multiple press conferences about whether Soviet women soldiers were permitted to use cosmetics in the field. At a press conference in Chicago, the specific date and location are documented in newspaper coverage of the period. She responded to the assembled journalists with a statement that has been quoted and translated in various forms, but whose core content is consistent across the sources. She was 26 years old. She had already destroyed 309 fascist invaders, and she asked the journalists whether they thought they had been hiding behind her back for too long. The room, by multiple accounts, went quiet. When I was working through the administrative records governing the post-war treatment of female veterans, specifically the Veterans Administration files, and the documentation of how service categories were assigned for pension and housing benefit purposes, I found a bureaucratic pattern so consistent that it couldn't have been accidental. Female veterans who applied for combat veteran status in the immediate post-war period were systematically reclassified. Snipers were recategorized as medical personnel. Combat pilots were reclassified as transport aviation workers. Anti-aircraft gunners were listed as communications staff. The reclassification reduced or eliminated the combat service benefits to which the actual service records entitled them. It wasn't a single policy directive, or, if it was, I have not found that directive. It was a consistent administrative practice, applied across multiple Veterans Administration regional offices, that produced the same outcome in case after case. The personnel file with its instructor, non-combat, recommendation sits at the end of this administrative logic. The war was over. The institution that had needed these women was done with them. The forms were amended. The archive kept both versions. Alexievich's The Unwomanly Face of War, first published in 1985 and formally criticized by Soviet cultural authorities as insufficiently heroic in its portrayal of wartime experience, collects testimony from hundreds of female veterans across decades of interviews. The criticism the book received is itself a primary source. What the cultural authorities objected to was not inaccuracy. The accounts are documented and cross-checkable against military records where records exist. What they objected to was particularity. The book insists on specific, unbeautiful details: the weight of a rifle on a small body, the difficulty of maintaining personal hygiene in field conditions, the specific smell of hospitals, the dreams about food, the loneliness, the grief that didn't resolve into pride. It insists on the experience rather than the symbol. The Soviet commemorative apparatus had no category for that insistence. After the Soviet Union's dissolution, after Alexievich received the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2015, the book became a standard text in Russian schools. The apparatus that criticized it is gone. The testimonies it collected, of women who knew they were the only archive of their own experience, are still there. The 588th Regiment's operational log at Samo records sortie by sortie across 3 years of continuous operations. The entries for individual nights show the number of sorties flown, the targets bombed, the aircraft lost, and the pilot names associated with losses. The names in the loss column are women's names. Reading through several consecutive months of the log is a specific kind of experience. The rhythm of nightly operations, the sortie numbers accumulating, and then occasionally a name in the loss column that doesn't reappear in subsequent entries. The log continues. The missing name continues to be absent. The PO-2 biplanes continued flying. The Iron Crosses for shooting one down continued to be awarded on the German side. The regiment flew until the war ended. Their total sortie count, more than 23,000, appears in the final summary entry at the end of the log. Below it, in the administrative notation that closes the file, a processing clerk has entered the regiment's formal disbandment date, the 9th of May, 1945. The same date as the German surrender. 309 confirmed kills. 309. Each kill verified by 2 witnesses per Red Army sniper protocol. Date, grid reference, weapon type, and entered in Pavlichenko's sniper's notebook, which was reviewed and countersigned by her commanding officers, and which survives in verifiable form in archival collections. The record is precise, authenticated, and institutional. It was produced by the same military bureaucracy that, at the war's end, recommended its producer for a non-combat instructor role and filed both documents in the same folder. The sniper's notebook and the employment assessment, together in the same archive box, the record of what she had done, and the record of the institutional decision about what that meant for her future, both in the same folder. The folder is in Podolsk. The archive is open. Chapter 16. The Partisans, the Occupied, and the Complicated Nation. The 14th of October, 1942. A village in Volhynia, German-occupied Ukraine. A village council meeting is being held, and the agenda has been recorded in a minute book that survives in the Ukrainian National Archive. The minute book is written in Ukrainian, with German marginal notations added by an occupation official who reviewed it at some later point. The agenda has 3 items. Item 1 covers German-mandated grain collection quotas, the compulsory requisitions that define the material relationship between the occupying administration and the villages under its control. Item 2 covers 3 families' requests for firewood allocation from the communal woodpile, a modest domestic matter recorded with careful attention to the quantities requested. Item 3, in the original Ukrainian, has been crossed out in the minute book, completely obliterated in black ink, applied by whoever reviewed the document. Under infrared photography conducted by Ukrainian archivists and published in a 2019 collection, the crossed-out text becomes readable. The item reads, Discussion of Community Welfare Matters. Below the heading, the infrared reveals 5 names. 3 of those names are identifiably Jewish surnames. The meeting record, which an occupation official decided should not survive legibly, survived anyway. The infrared found the names that the black ink was supposed to erase. The Soviet partisan movement, at its peak in 1943, comprised approximately 200,000 active fighters operating in German-occupied territory across a front from the Baltic to Ukraine. The Soviet central headquarters of the partisan movement, established in May of 1942 and staffed by regular Red Army and NKVD officers, coordinated the movement through radio communication networks and embedded political commissars who maintained ideological oversight and reported directly to Moscow. This is the administrative reality of what is sometimes presented in popular accounts as a spontaneous popular uprising. It was partly a spontaneous response to German occupation. Genuine anti-German resistance existed, and it existed before the Soviet command structure reached it. But the Moscow-directed apparatus worked systematically to bring that resistance under centralized control, to subordinate independent partisan groups to the regular command structure, and to ensure that partisan operations served Red Army strategic priorities rather than local defensive or retributive goals. Both things were true simultaneously. Popular resistance and Soviet state direction, operating in the same forests, sometimes in the same units. The August to September 1943 partisan rail operations, codenamed Rail War and Concert, coordinated with the Soviet operations following Kursk to disrupt German logistics in occupied territory. The operational records show approximately 2,000 kilometers of rail track damaged or destroyed across occupied Belorussia, Ukraine, and Russia during these operations. German military railway administration records from the same period, available in the captured document collections at the National Archives in Washington, indicate that German repair capabilities were sufficient to restore approximately 80% of disrupted lines within roughly 2 weeks of each attack wave. The partisan rail campaign was strategically significant. It consumed German engineering resources. It complicated German logistical scheduling. It forced the diversion of security forces that might otherwise have been available at the front. It was not decisive in the way Soviet official histories sometimes implied. The distinction matters, and the German repair records are the evidence that makes it. Kenneth Slepyan's work on the Soviet partisan movement, Stalin's Guerrillas, published in 2006, describes a movement that was genuinely both things: popular resistance and Soviet state apparatus operating simultaneously, often in productive tension with each other. Alexander Hill, working from a different archival basis in the war behind the Eastern Front from 2005, emphasizes more strongly the extent to which the Moscow-controlled network imposed Stalinist political priorities on local resistance, including the execution of non-communist partisans and the enforcement of Soviet collectivization policies in nominally liberated areas. I find both accounts partially correct. The partisan movement was not homogeneous. It varied by region, by command, by the personality of specific partisan commanders, and by the nature of the German occupation in different areas. A single characterization, heroic resistance or Soviet terror instrument, is insufficient for all of it. The minute book from the 14th of October, 1942, with its 3 items and its crossed-out Jewish names, is evidence that what happened in occupied territory defies the clean categories that both Soviet official history and Cold War anti-communist historiography preferred. The Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the UPA, represents the most difficult aspect of the occupied territory's history to discuss without oversimplification in either direction. The UPA was the armed wing of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and it fought against German occupation forces, against Soviet partisan formations, and against Polish civilian populations in a 3-directional conflict of extraordinary violence. The mass killing of Polish civilians in Volhynia in 1943 and 1944, estimates range from 50,000 to over 100,000 Polish deaths, was carried out primarily by UPA formations in operations that targeted civilian populations rather than military or paramilitary opponents. Post-Soviet Ukrainian official historiography has sometimes presented the UPA as straightforwardly anti-fascist freedom fighters. Soviet-era historiography presented them as purely fascist collaborators. Neither framing accommodates the documented historical record, in which the same organization was simultaneously conducting armed resistance against German occupation and massacring Polish civilians. The Ukrainian National Archive holds material that supports both characterizations. History that acknowledges only one of them is serving a political function rather than a historical one. The German occupation of Soviet territory was administered through a specific bureaucratic architecture that the captured document collections allow us to examine in considerable detail. The Reichskommissariat Ukraine and the Reichskommissariat Ostland created administrative hierarchies that reached from Reich-level commissioners down through regional Generalkommissare and Gebietskommissare to the village-level local administrators, the starosti, the headmen, who were typically drawn from the local population and held responsible to the German administration for meeting its requirements. The village headman occupied a position of irreducible moral complexity. He was the interface between German demands and his community's survival, responsible simultaneously for delivering the grain quotas and wood fuel requirements the Germans specified, and for managing the community's internal life in ways that the Germans didn't supervise directly. Some headmen used that unsupervised space to protect community members. Some used it to settle local scores. Some did both at different times. The minute book from October of 1942 is a document produced by this system, and the crossed-out names on item 3 represent a headman making a specific choice about which community welfare matters should and shouldn't survive in a record that German officials would review. The partisan radio communications network, which connected fighting units in occupied territory to Moscow via one-time cipher pads, was theoretically unbreakable and operationally vulnerable in a specific, traceable way. The cipher security depended entirely on the physical security of the cipher pads. When pads were captured, and this happened on multiple documented occasions, through the overrunning of partisan bases, through the capture of couriers, and through infiltration operations, the German Abwehr was able to conduct playback operations, broadcasting false orders to genuine partisan units on authenticated cipher frequencies. Post-Soviet research has identified at least 7 partisan operations between 1942 and 1944 that were compromised through captured cipher materials. The operations involved Soviet partisans being directed toward German ambushes or being given false intelligence about German positions that led them into prepared killing grounds. The cipher system that protected Soviet communications from the theoretical threat of cryptanalysis was defeated by the physical threat of capture. Security on paper, vulnerability in field conditions. When Soviet forces liberated occupied territories in 1943 and 1944, the NKVD's filtration apparatus followed close behind the frontline forces. The process of screening liberated populations, assessing each person's conduct under occupation for evidence of collaboration, was conducted under conditions where the evidentiary standards were inevitably compromised. Witnesses whose testimony was being used to assess collaboration had their own interests in the process. Individuals who had held administrative roles under German occupation, even roles that had served primarily to protect community members from German demands, were inherently suspect under the filtration methodology. The people being screened had survived 3 years of German occupation, which itself required various degrees of accommodation with the occupying power. The filtration process applied post-liberation Soviet standards to survival decisions made in conditions that the post-liberation assessors hadn't experienced. The numbers of people detained in filtration operations vary across different archival sources and different post-Soviet scholarly assessments, but the process itself, systematic, Soviet-administered, operating immediately in the wake of genuine liberation from German terror, is documented in NKVD records that have been partially available since the 1990s. Simultaneously with the liberation of occupied territories, and this is the detail that the liberation narrative requires you to hold in suspension, the Soviet state was conducting ethnic deportations of entire national groups from Soviet territory. The Chechen Ingush people, approximately 400,000 people deported in February of 1944, in an operation conducted in 4 days by NKVD troops, using railway logistics coordinated with the military supply system. The Crimean Tatars, approximately 190,000 people, deported in May of 1944. Volga Germans, approximately 400,000 people, deported beginning in 1941. The deportations used the same railway system that was simultaneously supplying the Red Army's advances. The same NKVD apparatus that was processing the filtration of liberated populations in the West was conducting the deportation operations in the East and South. The Soviet Union that was fighting a war against an ideology of racial categorization and collective punishment was conducting its own program of collective punishment against entire ethnic populations on grounds of presumed collective guilt. Both things were happening at the same time, within the same state, organized by the same administrative apparatus. The minute book from October of 1942 has 3 items. The third item is crossed out. The crossed out item, visible under infrared light, mentions 5 names, 3 of them Jewish. The German official who crossed it out was, presumably, acting on standard occupation administrative logic. Records of community welfare discussions involving Jewish residents were not to be preserved. The village headman who wrote the item knew, presumably, that German officials reviewed the minute book. He wrote it anyway. Whether the 5 names were protected, whether the community welfare matters they were named under resulted in anything helpful, whether any of them survived the occupation, the archive doesn't say. The minute book records the meeting. It doesn't record what happened after the meeting ended, or what happened to the 5 names, or what the headman decided to do with the space between what he wrote and what the German official later crossed out. The infrared photograph preserves the names. The story beneath them remains in the darkness of a history that didn't complete its own record. Chapter 17. The Victory and Its Shadows, What the Soviet Union Won, and What It Cost. In the Presidential Archive of the Russian Federation, in a file designated Fond 45, a 12-page typed document is titled Draft Remarks for V.I. Stalin, Victory Celebration, May 9, 1946. The document was prepared for the first anniversary of the German surrender, ended as the text of a formal address. It is printed on official stationery. 11 of its 12 pages follow the standard cadences of Soviet official commemoration, the victory, the party's leadership, the people's heroism, the international significance of the defeat of fascism. On page 9, however, there is a paragraph that does something different. It enumerates, it lists, in itemized form, the dead, the soldiers, the workers, the children left without parents. It names the cities that were destroyed. It describes the specific weight of what was lost. The paragraph is 312 words long. It is crossed out in blue pencil, with a thoroughness that leaves no line readable without the assistance of an archivist's lamp. In the margin beside the crossed-out paragraph, in handwriting that Russian archivists have compared to Stalin's authenticated documents, are 4 words in Russian. Lishnaya, ubrat, unnecessary, remove it. The victory was 1 year old. The dead were already being removed from the official account of the event they had created. On the 9th of May, 1945, at 0:43 hours Moscow time, the instrument of German unconditional surrender was signed at Berlin-Karlshorst. Marshal Zhukov presided on the Soviet side. The ceremony was concluded within an hour. Zhukov, in his memoir, records something about the moment after the signing that I have returned to many times. He writes that what he felt was not triumph. The Russian word he uses in the original is torzestvo, which implies public ceremonial victory. What he felt, he writes, was pustota, emptiness. The The specific Russian connotation of pustota is the emptiness of a vessel that has been completely drained. It is a word that describes aftermath rather than conclusion. He was standing in a room in Berlin. The war was over, and the word he reached for, alone with his own experience, was the word for a container with nothing left in it. Vasily Semyonovich Grossman had been with the Soviet Army since the first weeks of the war. He was a correspondent for the Red Star newspaper, and he went where the army went, through the retreats of 1941, through Stalingrad, through the liberation of Ukraine, into the ruins of the German death installations in Poland, and eventually into Berlin itself. In September of 1944, following the liberation of the Treblinka site in occupied Poland, Grossman filed a piece, published as The Hell of Treblinka, that became one of the foundational documents of Holocaust testimony, and was submitted as evidence at the Nuremberg Tribunal. He described what he found in terms that the available vocabulary was insufficient for, and the insufficiency of the vocabulary is itself recorded in the prose. The sentences reach for precision and find that precision runs out before the scale of what is being described does. His later novel, Life and Fate, written between 1950 and 1960, placed a Soviet physicist simultaneously in a German prisoner of war camp and a Soviet system of control, and drew the comparison that the Soviet state found intolerable. In 1961, KGB officers appeared at Grossman's apartment and confiscated the manuscript, the typescripts, and the typewriter ribbons. The officer in charge reportedly told Grossman that the book would not be published for 200 years. A microfilm copy, smuggled to Switzerland, was published in Lausanne in 1980. Grossman died in 1964, never having seen it in print. Zhukov, the face of Soviet victory, was demoted in 1946. The official reason given was arrogance and self-promotion. Accusations that Stalin's inner circle had been preparing since the victory celebrations made Zhukov's popularity in Moscow visible and politically inconvenient. He was sent to command the Odessa military district, then the Ural military district. Honorable postings, not imprisonment, but removals from Moscow that served the same political function as the earlier physical removals of figures whose proximity to power had become a problem. The man who had coordinated the defense of Moscow, the Stalingrad encirclement, the Kursk defensive planning, and the assault on Berlin, who had been photographed accepting Germany's surrender and riding a white horse through Red Square at the Victory Parade in June of 1945, was, within 12 months of the victory, administratively exiled to a provincial command. The victory had been claimed by the state. The individual who had been its most visible military instrument was being moved away from the center where claiming could happen. The question of whether the Soviet political system caused its own victory or survived despite itself is the central debate of Eastern Front historiography, and I want to address it directly rather than resolve it falsely. Richard Overreach, in Russia's War, argues that Stalinist centralization, while deeply costly, provided the organizational coherence that total war mobilization required, that no liberal democratic system could have achieved the industrial evacuation of 1941 or the resource allocation of 1942 under comparable circumstances. The argument has significant evidential support. The evacuation was real, the production numbers were real, the central coordination that produced them was real. Sean McMeekin, in Stalin's War from 2021, argues the opposite pole, that Stalin's decisions, the pact with Hitler, the purge of the officer corps, the suppression of intelligence before Barbarossa, made the war so much more costly than it needed to be, that victory is the wrong category, that the Soviet Union survived a catastrophe it had partly engineered. This argument also has significant evidential support. The purge records are real. The intelligence suppression is documented. The 1941 disasters were real. My honest assessment, after working through this material at length, is that both arguments are partially correct, and that the tension between them cannot be dissolved without falsifying one side of the evidence. The Soviet system was capable enough to survive a catastrophe it had helped to create, and that specific combination of capability and culpability is what the historical record shows. The ordinary people of the Soviet Union experienced the victory of May of 1945 as something that the political argument between Overreach and McMeekin struggles to accommodate. Elena Zubkova's Russia After the War, drawing on letters, diaries, and personal testimonies from the immediate post-war period, describes a genuine and overwhelming response to the end of the fighting. Joy, grief, relief, the particular exhaustion of a country that had been carrying a weight whose full dimensions only became visible when it was put down. There was real mourning for the dead, finally permissible in ways that wartime had complicated. There was widespread expectation, recorded in letters home from demobilizing soldiers and in the reports that NKVD informers filed on public mood, that the post-war world would be different from what had preceded it, more open, less fearful. A country that had paid so much for its survival would be trusted, perhaps, with more of its own life. That expectation was, with very few exceptions, frustrated. The political system that the army had fought to preserved itself, intact, and resumed its pre-war character with a fidelity that those who had hoped for change found devastating. The post-war period's most significant act of historical memory management was not the suppression of specific events or the falsification of specific numbers, though both happened, and we have seen examples of both throughout this series. It was the systematic conversion of the war's individual experience into a collective, state-managed symbol. The specific process Alexievich documented for women's service, the encouragement to re-enter domestic life, to allow the war to become something that had happened to others, applied more broadly to the entire veteran population. Veterans who told stories that didn't conform to the official narrative, stories of German prisoner of war camps, of filtration detention, of Strafbot service, of the particular texture of fear that didn't resolve cleanly into heroism, found those stories unwelcome in the official commemorative space. The stories were not erased. They were socially managed. They were told in kitchens, in private, to children who would carry them into the post-Soviet period, and eventually to the oral historians who collected them. When I was working through the final phase of this project, the post-war materials, the memory management, the institutional disposition of the victory, I found myself returning repeatedly to the presidential archive document with the blue pencil crossing. The paragraph about the dead, the crossed-out enumeration of what had been lost, and the four-word marginal note, Lishneye, Ubrat, unnecessary, remove it. I want to be honest about what this document does to me as a historian. It is a document of a kind of practical contempt for the dead, for the people who survived them, for the possibility that a public accounting of cost might be owed to those who had paid it. The paragraph that was crossed out was not inaccurate. Someone had calculated the figures, written them into a speech, and then someone else had decided the figures were unnecessary for the purposes to which the victory was being put. Remove it. The verb is not revise. It is not reconsider. It is ubrat, clear away, as you clear away something that is in the way. The arc of this series has moved from a carbon copy communique that dismissed 84 intelligence warnings on the eve of the greatest military disaster in Soviet history, to a pencil circle around a verified casualty figure that the state kept private for 31 years. Between those two documents, there is a war. There are 3 million men and women who crossed the Volga into Stalingrad. There are the Tankograd workers standing at machines in -15-degree factory halls. There is Pavlichenko's sniper notebook with its 309 countersigned entries. There is Rokossovsky's service record with its blank space where the NKVD detention years should be. There is Grossman at Treblinka, reaching for words that don't exist. There is the felt notebook with the arithmetic paper, last entry dated the 14th of November, 1941, all remaining pages blank. The war is in the archive. The archive is in the names, the forms, the requisitions, the fuel logs, the personnel assessments, the radio logs dying entry by entry over 5 days in June of 1944. The archive doesn't conclude. It simply stops generating new documents at a certain point and leaves everything it holds in the condition it was in when the filing ended. Life and Fate was published in Lausanne in 1980, 15 years after Grossman's death. It was published in Russia in 1988. It is in Russian school curricula in 2026. The KGB officer who told Grossman the book would not appear for 200 years was wrong by 180 years. The book about a war that the state tried to own entirely is being read by the grandchildren of the people who fought that war, in a country that has not yet finished deciding what the war means, or who is permitted to say so. The Presidential Archive holds the draft remarks with the blue pencil crossing. The Bundesarchiv holds Halder's diary with the underlined sentence about broken myths. Sasamo holds the 62nd Army sector maps with their green basement notations. The Ukrainian National Archive holds the infrared photograph of the 5 crossed-out names. The Russian State Archive of the Economy holds the statistical report with its pencil circle and its 4-word note. The archive holds all of it. Outside, the war has been over for 80 years. Inside the archive, it is still the 14th of June, 1941, and the communiqué is still being typed.